Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to welcome you all to the Bangladesh at 50 conference. Looking back, looking forward. My name is Chelsea Farrell, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Lakshmi, Mittal and Family South Asia Institute at Harvard University. The Institute engages in interdisciplinary research to advance and deepen the understanding of critical issues in South Asia and its relationship with the world. The Mittal Institute acts as a platform for South Asia-related activities and research across the various schools and departments at Harvard. As part of this mission, we run many different programs, including student and faculty grants programs, a semester seminar series, programs for visiting scholars and fellows, and workshops and conferences such as this one. The Mittal Institute has a long tradition of working in Bangladesh and has sponsored several scholars and artists from the region to come to Harvard. We have held a number of events over the years on topics related to Bangladeshi current and historical issues, and have participated in events and hosted conferences in Bangladesh. We are so grateful to many of our Bangladeshi supporters, among them Rajiv and Nadia Samdani, the Khader family, Professor Ruhul Abed, Associate Professor of Brown University's Medical School, and Professor Kaushik Basu, Professor of International Studies at Cornell University. We would also like to thank BRAC and BRAC University for their collaboration with the Institute on a number of events, both at Harvard and in Dhaka. During the breaks between panels today, we will share works of two Bangladeshi artists who were selected as fellows through the Mittal Institute's Visiting Artist Fellows program. Through a competitive process, the program offers fellowships to 4 mid-career artists from across South Asia and invites them to Harvard's campus for 2 months. Artists use this time to engage with Harvard faculty and students in the classroom and to showcase their work through a public talk and an exhibition. The program allows the Harvard community to engage with artists of diverse backgrounds whose work in various mediums addresses social, economic, and political issues in South Asia. On behalf of the Institute, I would like to thank all of those who have made this conference possible, especially the 2 professors who have co-organized this conference, Professor Marty Chen, Lecturer on Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and Professor Richard Cash, Senior Lecturer on Global Health at the Harvard T. Chan School of Public Health. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Taran Khanna, Jorge Paulo Lehman Professor at the Harvard Business School and Faculty Director of the Mittal Institute. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chelsea. Good morning and good evening and good afternoon, depending on where you are in this Zoom world. Welcome to this Bangladesh conference. We're extremely pleased to have you. As Chelsea mentioned, at the Mittal Institute, we focus very much on doing work that's relevant to all the countries of South Asia, and are, of course, very interested in comparative work across the different countries. And are really pleased to have this opportunity led by my colleagues, Marty and Richard, to deepen our engagement with Bangladesh. And let me add my thanks to all the scholars from Bangladesh, as well as from the US and elsewhere who are participating in this. We're very grateful for your support in building this. As befits the Mittal Institute, what you'll see in all these panels is incredible diversity of topical area. The one area that's underrepresented that I would have liked to see some more on is science. But of course, that's a problem with most developing countries. We don't have enough scientific advancement going on, and it's a focus of the Institute is to try and nurture that along. But you'll see ample representation of civil society, social sciences, politics, history, the arts, things that Bangladesh is rightly celebrated for. And I'm really looking forward to learn from my colleagues. I'm going to hand it over to people who actually know much more, infinitely more about Bangladesh than I do, not least Marty and Richard. So let me formally introduce my colleague, Marty Chen, which is how we know her, is a lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, co-founder and senior advisor of WIGO, which is the global network, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. Marty, I didn't know the full name of WIGO. I just know you as doing WIGO. So it's good to know. I knew it had to do with informal work. So see, I already learned something from this event. But most importantly, Marty has been a regular cheerleader for us to continue to engage with Bangladesh and of course with India, both countries in which she spent some time. So thank you, Marty, and thank you, Richard, for organizing this. And I'll hand off to you.
Thanks, Tarun, and thanks to the Mittal South Asia Institute for hosting this conference, and welcome. I want to join Chelsea and Tarun in welcoming all of you to this event. Richard Cash of the Harvard Chen School of Public Health and I were honored to be asked to help organize this conference, given our long association with Bangladesh, dating back over 50 years to the East Pakistan era, just before the War of Liberation. And we are so pleased that over 500 persons have registered for the conference. And we are very excited by the lineup of speakers and moderators. The conference will feature 5 panels on different aspects of Bangladesh's development over the past 50 years and conclude with a panel on the future of Bangladesh. There will be 3 panels on each of the 2 half days of the conference. Today features the panels on political development, economic development, and human development in Bangladesh. And tomorrow features the panels on women's empowerment, the role of civil society, and the future of Bangladesh. We sincerely hope you will join us both days. But if you miss one or more panels, the conference is being recorded, and we will share a link of the recordings with all registered participants. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce the first panel on political development in Bangladesh. The moderator is Gary Bass, a professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University. He is well known in Bangladesh for his book, The Blood Telegram, Nixon, Kissinger, and a Forgotten Genocide, which won several prestigious awards. The speakers in this panel, whom Gary will introduce, but who probably don't need an introduction, are Ronak, Jahan, and Rahman Soban. So Gary, over to you to begin the conference. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. I'm honored to be here. I greatly appreciate this. And I wanted to send my sincere thanks to the Mittal Institute, to Tarun Khanna, as well as to Marty Chen, who's done such a wonderful job of bringing us all together. Chelsea Farrell, Megan Siwek, everyone has done a wonderful job, and I'm deeply honored to be here. It's my privilege to introduce Professor Ronak Jahan and Professor Rahman Soban. Professor Ronak Jahan is currently a distinguished fellow at the Center for Policy Dialogue in Bangladesh, and has previously served as a professor of political science at Dhaka University and a senior research scholar and adjunct professor at Columbia University. She headed the women's programs at the International Labor Organization, the ILO, and the UNAPDC in Kuala Lumpur. Her many publications include Pakistan, Failure in National Integration, published by Columbia University Press, Bangladesh Politics, Problems and Issues, published by the University Press, The Elusive Agenda, Mainstreaming Women in Development, published by Zed, Bangladesh, Promise and Performance, again published by Zed Books, and Political Parties in Bangladesh, Challenges of Democratization, published by Pratoma. She received her PhD in political science from Harvard University, so this is a homecoming for her. Professor Rahman Soban is chairman of the Center for Policy Dialogue in Bangladesh. He served as a professor of economics at Dhaka University, as a member of the Bangladesh Planning Commission, as Director General of the Bangladesh Institute of Development Studies, as the founder and executive chairman of CPD, and executive director of the South Asia Center for Policy Studies. In 1981, he served as a member of the first caretaker government headed by President Ahmed. He was actively associated with the Bangladesh nationalist movement in the 1960s and was a member and was a participant in the liberation struggle in 1971. He was awarded the nation's highest civilian award for that. He has published extensively on subjects about the political economy of development, foreign aid, petropolitics, agrarian reform, regional cooperation in South Asia, democracy, and governance. Among his most recent publications, there are Challenging the Injustice of Poverty, published by Sage, Untranquil Recollections, The Years of Fulfillment, also published by Sage, and the second volume of his memoirs, Untranquil Recollections, Nation Building in Post-Liberation Bangladesh, will also be published by Sage. My two distinguished panelists, who by the way are appearing in the same window, we have Professor Jahan on the left and Professor Soban on the right. These two distinguished panelists have proposed some guiding questions to start their remarks. They're going to speak, then I'll ask a few questions to them, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers from the audience, again, conducted as always these days through Zoom, and I'll be moderating through that. So I wanted to start with a question to Professor Jahan about how a quarter century of nationalist struggle against Pakistan, how this shaped the founding principles of the Bangladesh state, and why and how did these principles succeed in gaining popular support so quickly? And that's a question to Professor Jahan, please.
Thank you very much, Gary, for your kind introduction, and thanks to Mittal Institute for organizing this webinar. For me, who grew up in the 1950s and 60s when our nationalist struggle was also gaining momentum, who witnessed the historic events of March 1971, and who lived through our national liberation war, it is a great moment of joy to be able to celebrate the golden jubilee of our independence. At the time of our independence, there were many doubts expressed, particularly by people outside of Bangladesh, about whether Bangladesh will survive as a state. That there were fears that there would be bloodbath, there would be chaos. But surprisingly, within a few months, we became politically quite stable, and we started our journey as a parliamentary democracy. And within a year, we formulated our constitution, which adopted 4 fundamental principles of state, which I would like to call as our founding principles. And these 4 principles were nationalism, secularism, democracy, and socialism. So what I would like to do is first talk a little bit about how in 1972, in our constitution, and also we ourselves conceptualized and viewed these 4 founding principles. And then I will turn to the second question, that how did these 4 principles, founding principles, become acceptable, or how a consensus was developed so quickly around these 4 founding principles in the 24 years of our nationalist struggle. So let me first start with our first principle, which is nationalism. In 1972, in our constitution, nationalism was defined as Bengali nationalism. So that the basis of our nationalism was our language, Bengali. But when I was reading through the debates in the Constituent Assembly, and also an interesting speech that was made by the father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, on 4th November 1972, when the Constitution was formally adopted. He said, yes, our nationalism is based on our language, but there are many nations where we have nations, multi-language nations. So it is not just the language, but it is our common struggle for nationhood that has made our claim to a nation state uh, um, uh, recognized and supported by people. So he described it as a feeling. A nation is if a group feels that they are a nation and they are willing to struggle for it. So I found that interesting because generally we thought that the emphasis was just simply on language and not our long struggle for our nationhood. The second principle, founding principle, was secularism. And again, secularism, the way we conceptualized it, there are 5 aspects to it. One is equal rights of all religious groups. Second, that equal freedoms to practice all religions. Third was that there should not be any organization, political organization based on religion. On that basis, religion-based parties were prohibited in Bangladesh when we became independent. But so our understanding was no violence on the basis of that no communal violence. But what I found most interesting in some of the speeches of the founding father was that he repeatedly talked about the responsibility of the majority community towards the minority community, that it is not simply enough that there would be equal rights and equal freedoms, but majority community has a responsibility to ensure that there is no violence or no injustice done to people of the minority community. I think this is something that we often forget. The third founding principle was democracy. And here our understanding and our constitution defines it more or less the all the elements of a liberal democracy, which means civil, political, and fundamental rights, free elections, independence of the judiciary, freedom of media, parliamentary supremacy, and so on. Again, what I found interesting in that speech of Sheikh Mujib of 4th November is that when he was introducing the 4 principles, he acknowledged that in many liberal democracies, democracy serves to protect the interest of the elite and the powerful. So he said that what we would like to do is to make sure that the elites don't capture democracy, that our democracy serves the interest of the marginalized and the excluded. And on that basis, he then defended our 4th principle, which is socialism. And 2 aspects of socialism was emphasized. One is elimination of exploitation, and the second is the establishment of a more egalitarian society. Let me then turn to the second question, that how we built a consensus around these 4 founding principles in the 24 years of our nationalist struggle against Pakistan. Here, 5 issues which drove the Bengalis against the Pakistanis during 24 years of Pakistan. We started with the issue of language and culture. As you know, within a few months of establishment of Pakistan in February 1948, when Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was the founder of Pakistan, came to Bangladesh, at that time East Pakistan, and declared that only Urdu will be the state language of Pakistan. And then the students protested. And then from then on, the Bengali language movement started. In 1952, students shed blood in that movement, and it gained momentum every year. And finally, in 1956, Pakistani rulers accepted that Bengali also will be recognized as one of the 2 state languages of Pakistan. But even though Bengali was recognized as a state language, the struggle. There are constant attacks on Bengali language and culture. Pakistani rulers alleged always that Bengali was too much under Hindu influence. And Tagore's songs, Rabindranath Thakur's songs were banned in mid-60s in what was then East Pakistan. And so cultural activists from the beginning, all through 50s and 60s, they played a very important role in putting forward, in resisting this assault on our language and culture, and projecting Bengali language and culture and popularizing it. The second issue that drove us against Pakistan was the issue of place of religion in politics. From the beginning, Bengalis wanted harmony, communal harmony, because there were almost 20% Hindus left in what was then East Pakistan. So Bengali political leaders of the opposition party, they always believed in coexistence of Hindus and Muslims as equal citizens. And when Pakistan declared itself as an Islamic republic, then Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujib, who was then a member of the National Assembly, protested in the National Assembly in Pakistan. And Bengalis also were in favor of joint electorate, that Hindus and Muslims will be part of the same electorate. In 1964, when there were communal riots that broke up, the Bengali opposition political leaders, they actively worked to stop that riot. And this issue of religion was, of course, very closely linked to the issue of language, because all Bengali speakers, Hindu and Muslims, they were all supposed to be part of the common nationalist. The Bengali identity was emphasized over language. The third issue was autonomy. Again, from the beginning, the Bengali opposition political leaders, we emphasized regional autonomy for what was in East Pakistan in 1950. There is a Grand National Convention where only two subjects, foreign policy and defense, were supposed to be in the hands of the central government. So this autonomy issue was another running issue, which then we see in 1966 culminated in the famous 6 Points movement, which was the movement that was started by Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujib, which galvanized the whole nation. In 6 Points, again, only two subjects were left in the hands of the central government. And then we had the issue was also one of democracy, because the Pakistani rulers were mostly, Pakistan was ruled by civil, military, bureaucratic elites, and Bengalis have no place in that. And repeatedly there were denials of elections. In 1954, when the opposition Army League won the election in the provincial assembly, then within 90 days, that was there was a central rule imposed, and elections. The first election was in 1970, and the economy was the last issue, where we had always thought that resources were taken away from what was in East Pakistan to build central government. Let me then conclude on one final observation, and that is that all these issues were driving us against the central government, and they were brewing from 1947. But what is surprising, that how in the final phase, within a relatively short period of 69 to 70, that the whole nation was mobilized behind the nationalist struggle. And I will just mention here that with a personal story, that when I went as a graduate student at Harvard in 65, then only the movement against Ayub Khan, the martial law, the ruler, has just started. And when I came back to for data collection in '68, everything on the surface looked very calm. All the political leaders were in jail. But within 3 years, when I was interviewing, everybody was saying, there's just too much, we cannot stay together. And then, of course, within 2 years after that, in '71, in March, when the election result, people spontaneously rose up in resistance. So I think the question here is, yes, it is true that Bangabandhu played a very critical role in mobilizing the whole nation. But I think we need to also ask, why was it so acceptable to the general population? That why did our peasants rose up spontaneously and took up arms when they never knew how to use arms to fight our nationalist struggle? I think this is a question that we need to explore further. Thank you very much. And now over to Rehman, and I know I spoke a bit longer, so Rehman can speak a bit longer, and I will then speak, shorten my intervention next time.
Thank you.
Are you going to begin by posing any question to me? Do I take it up where you left off?
Yes, I think you are supposed to speak now.
All right. Well, according to our division of labor, Ronak gets to say all the positive things, and it comes over to me to see how the tradition of the founding principles was really carried over in practice in the process of both nation building and nation unbuilding, to the extent that that element came into play. Because as with all narratives of post-colonial societies, what you essentially dream about in many ways works very well. I think we had a very good dream on the economic front, but in other areas, the dreams were somewhat more, as I said, sort of went through a more darker phase. Now, I think as far as Bangladesh is concerned, I will really focus my remarks on two elements of the founding principles, democracy and socialism, and in fact, really take its trajectory to see what really were the driving forces which influenced this narrative. As far as democracy was concerned, right from the beginning, we faced a number of structural problems, which in fact had a defining impact on the working of the democratic process. I'll run through them actually very quickly. One of the more basic problems arose from the fact that over a period of almost 25 years, going back to the late 1950s, there was only one dominant democratic party in Bangladesh, the Awami League, eventually led by Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. There were other parties and they had their moments of glory. But in any process of democratic mobilization and contestation, the Awami League remained unchallenged in terms of its electability. And on the one occasion where they were given opportunity to express themselves in the 1970 election, they won an overwhelming majority, winning, I think, what is it, about 161 seats out of 163 available for contestation for the National Parliament. And this process carried over in post-liberation Bangladesh, because you had one leader who was treated in a way as above the fray, a founding father of a nation. You had a political party which was overwhelmingly dominant. And within this contextual framework, you needed to construct a democratic process. Now, unless we were not only a politically mobilized country, but we had also been invested with all the qualities of sainthood, when you in fact operate within the framework of such objective circumstances, the chances of this emerging as a strong, robust democratic culture is not great, because essential to that is that you have contestation and you have in fact political processes which in fact are there to challenge you. In fact, what resistance there was tended to manifest itself mostly at the underground level, where people thought, particularly those from the left, who had actually performed rather feebly during the course of the liberation war itself, thought that they now had an unfinished liberation struggle to, in fact, convert Bangladesh into some sort of a Maoist republic. And lots of arms were available to them to, in fact, indulge their fantasies in this particular area. Over and above that, of course, you also had the sense of empowerment of the military elements who had actually fought the war and who felt that they had as much of a right to nation building as the elected representatives, and therefore had a sense of unfulfilled or sense of disempowerment, which they felt had to be recognized. So these were the difficult circumstances in which the nation had to be built. And the byproduct of this was a concentration of power in the hands of Bangabandhu himself as the epitome of the nation building process. His assassination within 3.5 years of the establishment of a founding of the nation state led to a complete transformation in the political culture and virtual undoing of the founding principles around which the nation was constructed. The objective conditions which flowed from that period were twofold. One, you had set in motion the tradition of the all-powerful executive president, and when the presidential system returned to parliamentary system, an all-powerful executive prime minister. And this power was in fact actually, this power was in fact actually enhanced at the expense of the weakening of the elective bodies or the legislatures. Now, part of the weakening of the legislature originated from the fact that the electoral process itself was captured by the executive, and the early elections during the period where two generals in fact served as presidents, and the cantonment was the dominant political force in the country, ensured that the culture of the managed election would in fact actually ensure not only the ruling party that you want, but even those who would constitute the opposition tended to get kind of predetermined, where the more acceptable elements of the opposition found themselves happily elected, and those who were less desirable invariably ended up defeated in the elections. In this was really the culture which really emerged. And in this particular period of time, you had the undoing of a long period of democratic mobilization, which culminated in the emergence of an independent Bangladesh. When in fact, the political forces, first the Awami League, led by the daughter of Bangabandhu, who took over the leadership of the party in the beginning of the 80s. And then, strangely enough, by the widow of the first general, who in fact actually moved to in fact undo the democratic process and expose us to an era of cantonment rule, emerged actually as the leader of a party constructed in the cantonment, but in the period of the 1980s then reached fulfillment as a civilian democratic party based on street mobilization. And when they came together with the Awami League to overthrow the second military dictator, Ershad, we thought we had entered into a new democratic renaissance. Such was, in fact, the discourse on the street, a second liberation of Bangladesh, as we called it, at the end of 1990. And the expectation essentially was that you would have a rebuilding of democracy, which had been languishing in the cantonment. More to the point, you now had, for the first time, two strong civilian democratic parties. In fact, the BNP, led by Khalida Zia, actually, much to everyone's surprise, won the election in early 1991. And you had, in fact, a system of elections through a non-partisan caretaker system. I was, in fact, a member of that caretaker government at the beginning of 1991, which carried out perhaps the first free and fair election held in post-liberation Bangladesh in the accepted sense of the term. And this essentially held out great promise. But unfortunately, everything which looks promising in Bangladesh begins well, but doesn't always end in the same way. And so we began a process of undoing our greatest assets. One was converting a unique and well-functioning two-party system into a highly confrontational, almost tribalized society of Hutus and Tutsis, who in fact actually entered into such fierce contestation that it made the parliamentary system itself dysfunctional. Secondly, of course, what was meant to be, again, a role model just not for Bangladesh, but in fact for other developing countries getting their exposure to democracy, a system of free and fair elections under non-party caretaker system, we began picking at the edges of this system, and we went through a process of trying to unmake this. Now, in spite of all these best efforts of unmaking, we managed to hold 4 free and fair elections in 1991, in 1996, in 2001, and of course, again, with a brief episode of unmaking, which led to the military turning up again, another free and fair election in 2009. Those were the last free and fair elections we actually held. And this again had a negative effect because the next party which came in, the Awami League, went through the process of deciding that a system of non-partisan free and fair elections held under a caretaker system carried too many risks. One of the risks was that the incumbent party may not actually come back into power. They then re-amended the constitution and went back to holding elections under incumbent government. And of course, we went through 2, in a way you may call them sort of non-elections, which were essentially uncontested. The major opposition parties were given little opportunity to participate. There were electoral boycotts, there were violence, and eventually much manipulation of the electoral process. So this was the unfortunate narrative of democracy, both 50 years spent in trying to get an acceptable electoral system, which we have not succeeded, a dysfunctional parliament, which even when it was functioning, in fact, was too confrontational to do its role. And of course, now it is really dysfunctional without any capacity for holding anyone accountable. And you have an all-powerful executive. Now, I will briefly talk about the problems of socialism. Now, socialism virtually as a concept of a more equitable society, as the founding father thought of it, an exploitation-free society in which a privileged elite would not be permitted to capture power, virtually, in fact, had its swan song when the day he was actually assassinated. And the political and the economic agenda which was effectively put in place gradually led to a process of unchallenged attempts to, in fact, have a state-sponsored system of capitalism, which in its final phase has evolved into what we may call a very advanced process of crony capitalism. Now, this was not without its benefits, because in the process of state building of a sponsored capitalist class, massive resources, both through the banking system as well as through fiscal concessions and subsidies, contributed to converting a non-existent entrepreneurial culture into a highly dynamic entrepreneurial system. So there were positive results, which in fact will be talked about in the next session when we have demonstrated extraordinary capacities for growth. And this is spilled over into even poverty reduction and other positive gains. But the consequential outcome of this process of sponsored capitalism and of the state actually constantly tilting the balance of channeling resources into the hands of a politically patronized elite was increasingly, again, inegalitarian system and highly exploitative and unjust society in which most of the privileges of economic development and development and opportunities for development tended to be progressively concentrated. So today, we now have a system in which you have done well economically, you've had good growth rates, you've had poverty reduction, but you have had the emergence of a highly elitist first world society emerging, and a large, you may say, disenfranchised majority who have done well in an absolute sense, but in the face of extreme relative deprivation. And the worst aspect of this is it has led to the political capture of the system by an elite who, as a consequence, now completely dominate parliament. Virtually the entire parliament formally declares itself as businessmen, and those who do not are in fact aspirant businessmen who, given enough time in parliament, will also emerge as businessmen, and who in fact have used their power to in fact lead to a highly unregulated system, which has led to massive debt defaults, bringing our banking system close to a state of collapse. At least the governmental institutions are now in a state of great endangerment. And you have a system now in which commercial banks are using the deposits of hundreds and millions of people to in fact channel loans to a privileged elite who in many cases do not pay back these loans. So this has become a process of inequitable capital accumulation sponsored by an unregulated system of governance. So the political story and the philosophical outcome of this have been somewhat removed from the aspirations of the founding fathers. Of course, there are positive elements to the story, which you will hear about in later sessions, but these are the elements which I leave you with, and let Ronak carry on the story as to what we might do to try to turn this around.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So I'm going to keep this going by asking about what new visions, what actors, what institutions might be required to generate a more inclusive, a more just, more democratic, and a more sustainable political order in Bangladesh.
Thank you, Gary. And again, my apologies. Previously, you were supposed to ask the question and I asked Rehman to carry on. When we don't see your face, it is very difficult to focus. Anyway, to get back to your question, I will mostly focus on the part of rebuilding democracy. And I think Rehman would want to talk about rebuilding the principle of socialism, or how to rebuild the economy. As you all know, that rebuilding democracy is just not a challenge for Bangladesh, where of course we had so many breakdowns and there has not been a continuity. But even in established democracies, such as in our neighboring India, or even a very old democracy, such as the United States, we have now seen the major challenges of rebuilding democracy. So for Bangladesh, the way I look at it is that we should start with doing first the easier, more doable things where we already have some building blocks, for instance. So the first task I would say, is to give media and civil society complete freedom. Because if during the period of democracy from 1991 onwards, if one indicator was doing very well in Bangladesh and was always showing an upward trajectory, was the voice indicator. And that was because of the role that media was playing. For the first time, media started doing investigative journalism and unearthing all kinds of corruption, malfeasance. So they were really trying to do their job. Similarly, for the first time, we had human rights and other kinds of civil society organizations, again making demands on the political system. So that I find that here we have some traction. People are willing to take these institutions, democratic institutions, forward. So all of that needs to be done is if the government has lots of different kinds of acts to fetter this media. And I'm sure you have recently heard about the Digital Security Act, I think, and how journalists could be kept in prison, and a lot of this is not even, they cannot be given bails. So I think that if some of these, some of these laws are withdrawn, then I think even media and civil society can play its role. The second one, Rahman talked a lot about elections, free elections. It is not, we don't really need any technical knowledge or support to organize free and fair elections, because we indeed were able to organize 4 free and fair elections. But before we could organize a free and fair elections, I think we have to step back, our political actors have to step back from the winner takes all political culture. And how that can be done, I think it is not for, how that political will can be created. I think that the only political leaders, political activists, they would have to figure out. But unless we can determine, I have written about it many times, that unless we can ensure the fate of the losers, that if somebody loses an election, that he will or she will not face harassments of the party and the workers, other losses, even loss of life. So I think that the losers will live well for another 5 years or 4 years to face another day and win an election. So I think that kind of an understanding has to be brought about. So I think that is a serious challenge. Again, it is not simply in Bangladesh. Again, Rahman talked about our 2 parties becoming so confrontational, but I think I have lived in the United States for many years, and I've seen increasingly how even in the United States, the parties are almost getting tribalized and their supporters. So I think this is a global problem, and I think this whole electoral game, how we can do it in another, create another kind of an atmosphere, I think that's another major challenge. Third, I think again, the other challenge is again to establish rule of law. Again, it is fairly easy to say we need to bring back independence of judiciary and let law be to be implemented in a non-partisan way. But I think before we can do that, we have to see why is it that we are not able to improve on our rule of law situation. What is going on must be serving the interests of lot of powerful groups, and even people who are not powerful, they must be getting something out of this access patronage-based system. So unless we understand how the informal system works, and who it is benefiting and how, we would not be able to change it. So I think that to bring back rule of law as we had on the books, we have to first see why it got eroded in the first place. Unless it is serving a lot of people, the interests of loss of rule of law, it cannot be sustained for so long. So I think to rebuild that, we have to understand the current system and who it is serving, how, and how we can provide the same kinds of efficient and effective service within a rule of law and really justice, in that way. Law is, I find that law is one thing and justice is another thing. Then the fourth, I think, is that to rebuild democratic institutions in this world for the excluded, we really, particularly in Bangladesh, you will hear in the later panels that there has been tremendously rapid social development, economic growth, so that Bangladesh society is not what I was describing before as it was in 71. More or less an undifferentiated peasant society. A lot of what was then a budding middle class has become a very rich class. There are middle classes and then lower middle classes that are coming up with the different kinds of expectations. So to build new democratic institutions, we have to build stakes for these new people in the new institutions. The old style politics probably, or the old style institutions may not be good enough. And so for that, we need a lot of free discussions, new platforms. And unfortunately, what has happened that during 2006, 7, and even before that, when from 90s onwards, we had a lot of public discussion on political reforms of our electoral systems, checks and balance systems, political parties. But unfortunately, those kinds of discussions have stopped. And I think we need to start again those discussions and in a free, and for that again, we need the free atmosphere so that people can express their opinion so that we can rebuild. And my final point on which I will close is on a point of optimism. And that is that in Bangladesh, we are very used to seeing system breakdowns and then a lot of popular movements, again, renewals. So our story in some way is beginning, then some breakdowns, again, renewals. But recently in 2018, there was a very interesting street movement done mostly by high school students, 12-year to 14-year-olds, kids, when two of their, or a few of their fellow students were killed in a road accident. Then they spontaneously, these kids were on the streets trying to not only protest, but what impressed me is that all of our movements before were just protests, but these kids were showing an alternative way, that they were not just asking the state to do things, but they were trying to line up all the stars, all the cars. They were checking the licenses, and then they were those people who didn't have licenses, then they were then giving them to police. So to me, that if these 12 to 14-year-olds not only could just say that, no, we don't want this, but show us, no, this can be done in that in this way. And for 3-4 days in the middle of this torrential monsoon rain, hundreds and thousands of these 12, 14-year-olds were on the street showing another way of doing things in Bangladesh. Then I, for would not lose hope on Bangladesh. And I keep my faith on the next generation to keep our future in very good hands. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I wonder, Rahman, Ronak, that was wonderful. I wonder, Rahman, if you can share your thoughts on this. And also, if you have any.
Well, of course, I'm not going to come out as a 21st century Marx or Mao Zedong about how we are going to reconstruct socialism in Bangladesh. In fact, it's not a word which occurs very frequently in public discourse these days. But I think what is very important is to put down a few thoughts on what can be a more just society and how far this can be realized within the realm of the feasible. So what we essentially have in mind is that quite positive gains have, of course, been emerged. I mean, we have got high growth capitalism with reduced poverty, improvement in human development indicators, and in fact, an expanded safety net. But we, of course, have a much more egalitarian and a much more unregulated society within which this growth has actually taken place. And particularly since this is the centenary year of Bongo Bandhu, and we are also commemorating our 50th anniversary, we have to at least go through the motions of paying lip service to the notion of what can be done to create a more just and egalitarian society. So what are my thoughts on this? I think the most important thing is that the state must itself take on the responsibility of not tilting the balance in favor of the elite. Obviously, a lot of inequalities emerge through the dynamic of the market process. I don't want to go into the detailed debates on how markets function, but certainly the role of the state is very important. And if you in fact have a state which over a period of 40 years has in fact actually been permitting huge resources to be challenged into the hands of a privileged capital business elite, and is making no real regulatory effort to in fact recover this, and is letting these debts pile up so that a culture of default has in fact actually been institutionalized within the system, then it means that a huge resource transfer has taken place. First off, from public banks. In fact, some have bankrupted, some are near bankruptcy. And then when you have left it to the private commercial banks, then from the depositors of commercial banks, who are there in their millions, but whose resources are being accumulated by a business elite who do not repay those loans. Now, that is neither just nor is it very efficient. And in fact, it is a grave threat to our move towards becoming a more advanced developing country, in fact, to move into the category of being a developed country. This has to be, I think, be addressed over here. We need to go through a process, therefore, for depoliticizing appointments into our institutions of both regulation and governance. Most of them have been highly politicized, and for this particular reason, they are constrained from effectively discharging their responsibilities. I think we have Faisal Rahman here, who has actually worked in a regulatory institution. I hope he will have something to say on that, even though he always likes to be more positive. We then have the problem of, again, tilting the balance through budgetary dispensations, fiscal privileges, subsidies. If you, in fact, do a little balance sheet of, in fact, how much resources have been implicitly and explicitly directed to the elite through forms of tax concession and subsidies, and compare it to investments in social safety net programs and to, in fact, lending programs to the SME sectors, you will see a huge imbalance in the way in which resources have, in fact, actually been dispensed. And the next area you need to address is the democratization of both education and healthcare. the educational system has now effectively become a bifurcated system of private education, a lot of it given actually in the English language, and the public educational system, which has had at some point a tradition which has now been severely compromised, and which has essentially been the refuge of the less resource privileged. And the resources going into the educational system, public educational system, are in fact a fraction of what is minimally acceptable by any society as an appropriate allocation for the sector. The healthcare system, which in fact was severely exposed during the COVID crisis, pointed out the sorry state of public healthcare. And here again, you need to make massive investments, not just of resources, but of governance, so that people for both education and health access, in fact, are operating on a level playing field. Thirdly and fourthly, some of the most hardworking enabled people have been our working people, our farmers, the women who work in the garment industry, the women who are borrowing from the microfinance system. Now, what you really need is much more of institutional building, in which workers get a much higher share in the value addition process, which comes from their primary produce or, in fact, their labor. So whether we are talking about giving workers ownership rights in the companies where they work, whether we are talking about giving farmers who have quadruple production, but who don't anywhere near come near participating in the full value addition in the value chain, how they can be in fact integrated into the value chain in the way that has been brought about by Amul in India or by Seva in India as good examples of what could actually be done. Then finally, our migrants. Our migrants, of course, are some of the heroes of the developmental success of Bangladesh, who have given us $42 billion in our foreign exchange reserves, but who in fact go abroad under extremely adverse conditions, pay large sums of money, run huge risks. Now, after 40 years, this is simply not acceptable. You need to, in fact, create a set of institutions where you can collectively mobilize migrants, develop them into better trained, better equipped service exporting companies rather than individualized, exploited individuals. And you need to then, in fact, invest in enhancing their skills, in being able to negotiate their contracts, and in being able to then convert some of their remittances into major assets of a productive nature, which can buy into some of the more dynamic sectors of the economy. These are some of the fantasies I would like to have about what can be done about building a more just society. I would like to think that they are not in the realm of imagination, but are in the realm of the feasible. Thank you.
I love that. The dream of a better society, but in the realm of the feasible. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to, let me make just one comment and then I want to move. We have some wonderful questions from the audience and I'd like to move to those. That some of this decline goes on in the context of a global recession in democracy, that Larry Diamond at Stanford, a political scientist, has warned that for about the past 14 years, there's been a global sort of reverse wave against democratization. And in some ways, Bangladesh is caught up in that global tide. It's a regional tide too. If you look at the undermining of democratic institutions and civil society next door in India. But this trend, and it's also one that includes, just to be critical, for Harvard Conference with some Americans here, that the United States obviously had a catastrophic experience under Donald Trump. And it's not like that just suddenly goes away because Joe Biden is president. There's a long way to go. But this fear of an all-powerful executive prime minister, a prime minister who in some ways functions like a president, is one that really, I think, does really loom over the country. With problems, from arbitrary arrests of critics of the government, the Digital Security Act, which was mentioned, as stifling free expression and independent media. There's also problems of a security state that is feeling pretty, clearly pretty impervious. The UN is quite concerned about allegations of torture, extrajudicial killings, and disappearances. And the security forces and the army seem to feel that they can get away with an awful lot. Right now, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, as I'm sure many people will know, is asking for an investigation into a specific event, the death in pretrial detention of a writer, Mushtaq Ahmed, but also into the Digital Security Act itself. So this is part of a global pattern, but it's also attracted, I think, unwelcome attention from the outside world. We have a ton of excellent questions, and I'm going to throw out a couple of them just so that we have a hard stop at 8:25. I don't want to make sure that many of these get covered. One question from Salim Rehan, who's a professor of economics at the great Dhaka University, who asks about crony capitalism and elite state capture, and wonders, this is more directed to Rahman, what kind of political process you would suggest to counter crony capitalism and elite state capture. One question directed specifically for Ronak is about how this winner-take-all culture has developed in Bangladesh. Is this just because of politicians who have sort of played too rough, or do you think Bangladeshi society as a whole has also contributed to it? Let's start with those, and if we can try and go through those relatively quickly, because there are lots of great questions still waiting. Many thanks. Maybe if we could start, Rahman, do you want to go first, and then Ronak?
Oh, well, Salim and I have participated in many discussions attempting unsatisfactorily to answer his question. I think the problem obviously is that the government itself has to decide whether their long-term interests of moving the country towards a form of more advanced development is best served by a system of crony capitalism in which privileged people are given non-market, non-competitive access to resources, is going to serve their needs better. My suspicion is that if they, depending on which particular interests they wish to promote, if they have a longer term interest about how they want the economy to look, let alone how its politics to look, it would be to their advantage to, in fact, at least rein in the crony element of the capitalist system, and to see, in fact, that if you want to practice capitalism, then at least you do it within some agreed rules of the game where the competitive market system can effectively operate. But of course, if you want to address the politics of it, then you need to move into a situation in which you democratize access to electoral office. I mean, the big problem now is that participation in the electoral system has become a business investment. And the bigger the investments you make, the more likely you are to get in. And you are then seeing your political presence in the institution as a process of furthering your longer term business interests. Now you have to break away from that system and get to a point where you democratize the electoral process through perhaps a state funding of elections, where money itself is not the major variable, where you in fact have an oversight over the financing and use of funds in the election process, and where political parties are themselves then persuaded to give nominations both to a larger constituency of women as also to a larger constituency of working people. In fact, ironically, the most dynamic segments of the society, the farmers, the small and medium entrepreneurs, even some of your most competitive non-defaulting businessmen, your migrants, very few of them have any electoral representation. So there is a huge mismatch between the dynamic entrepreneurial class on the one hand and the voice they have in parliament. So this is this disconnect has to be reconnected, and the system of power must be equated with those who in fact contribute to the dynamic of the economy. I think that would be my response. But how to bring this about? I am looking for my magic wand.
Ronak, please.
Okay,
While you
thank
search
you.
for your magic wand.
Thank you. First of all, Gary, let me say that many of us here in Bangladesh also share the same concerns that you raised in your comment about all the things that are happening here, including all the violations of human rights. And this is why the first point that I made earlier is that for media and civil society and human rights activists, at least if they do not face all the obstacles, then people would get to hear about what is going on. So I think that is in the realm of the possible to withdraw all of these laws, for instance. To answer the question about the winner-take-all culture here, this has happened gradually over the years. This is the flip side of the comment of the coin of our economic success story. For instance, in the 70s, the governments really didn't have that much money to, if you are, and the budget was small. So if you are controlling the state, or if you are in government, you do not have that much patronage to give. But the more that we are growing now, so if you control the state, then you have so much more money to give to your supporters, so that the pool of the patronage system, that becomes much larger. And that is how over the years, this is taking place. Initially, up from 1991 up to say 2006, as I said before, every time there was an election, what we found is that incumbents were always losing the election. So at least people, which to me was an indication that people really don't like this system of so much a system of rule by patronage and corruption. So that the only thing they could do is vote the incumbents out. So for at least that system, even though it didn't take the winner takes all situation, then at least it could rotate and limit the situation. My current sort of worries now is not so much the winner takes it all, but what happens to the loser. Because now that nobody wants to be a loser even for 4 or 5 years. And so I think that we really need to get back into a situation to protect the losers. And then somehow we can go back to this rotation, even if we cannot fundamentally change. And then I think over the years, we can probably tackle the winner takes all situation. Thank you.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I'm going to throw out 3 more questions. I'm trying to pick ones that sort of hit at different issues because I'm mindful that we only have 10 minutes left. So first from Sanjan Haq, who asks whether or not there are parallels between Bangladesh's experience and other countries in Asia or beyond, and in particular about the sort of Faustian pact with businesses, whether that's equivalent to similar deals struck in Japan and Korea during their period. I'm obviously thinking of the work of the late Ezra Vogel, who we miss and who we mourn. Chris Kenna asks about the success of some famous NGOs in Bangladesh, including Grameen Bank, BRAC, and others, and wondering if any of you see hopes for further strengthening such grassroots NGOs. And our own Tarun Khana asks, what are the incentives for the elite to participate in the remaking of a system that rebalances things in favor of the disenfranchised? Why would they want to play ball with that? What possible incentive would they have to do that? So let me, and those, that will probably bring us to 825. So let's, we'll probably wrap with those. Thanks. Maybe Ronak, do you want to go first?
No, let Rahman go first with the parallel of Bangladesh and other, right?
Oh, yes,
Faustian.
yes.
Yes.
Oh,
He gets the
well,
best bargain.
we went through that phase, not just, I think, Japan and Korea, but once upon a time, even Suharto's Indonesia and Thailand and others were also seen as part of that Faustian Southeast Asian miracle story. I think the problem with all those is that the Faustian story eventually ended up in Korea with at least 3 presidents in jail. In fact, I think the latest lady is also heading that way. And in other cases, of course, the system was overturned. So as a system, it has very sort of, limited life. We are now talking about a country which is 50 years old. And so there's really no reason at all why you want to make a pact with these people. And the people with whom you're making a pact are really not the Samsungs and the Daewoo's with whom you are making pacts. They are the less efficient components even of the capitalist order as it is practiced over here. So essentially, you're doing this at the expense of a highly dynamic element, not just within the entrepreneurial community itself, but also within the other components of the Bangladesh miracle, the women, the workers, the farmers, all of them. And in fact, it is in Bangladesh's interest from that point of view that you bring together both an element of justice as well as an element of efficiency, where the growth narrative as also the justice narrative, in fact, actually go hand in hand. This is a major liability. And in fact, the political consequences are going to be much more on the lines of the fate of the Park Chung-hees and the Suhartos, rather than the more sort of smooth evolution of the Japanese-Singapore narrative over here. And it is not even in the interest of the present ruling elite, and certainly not of the Prime Minister herself, that a system of this nature should in fact prevail. Because you want a system which can be bequeathed to successors and which is a working system. And this is really not a sustainable order.
Okay. Let me answer the question on the future of the NGOs. I think there is still a lot of scope for NGO activities. See, the main successes such as BRAC and Grameen and others, Grameen is not actually an NGO, but it was that they were mostly service delivery NGOs. And then they worked also, there was a very good government and NGO partnership that worked very well. And and the distinguishing feature is that they brought many of their services up to scale at a national level. So Bangladesh still needs, even in the health sector, I think that there are a lot of underserved areas, underserved issues. So if there is again a government and NGO partnership in identifying areas, and also the NGO entrepreneurs, like we had with our pioneers like Abed and Yunus and Zafrullah and others. Then I think there is a lot of scope. We already miss NGOs, for instance, during the COVID crisis, that at the community level to mobilize people, even raising awareness. These are the things NGOs do best. So I can see a lot of scope for NGO activity. And just in 1 minute to answer the other question, and maybe Reman may want to talk about this elite, what is in it for elites to get into any rebuilding of democratic institutions. Elites, and for that matter, every class, everybody works in their enlightened self-interest. And if elites were then to see that even to protect their own interests, it is better to do some, to get on board with some reforms, then I think they will do it. But it is a question of how much pressure can the excluded build, and so that they can not only put pressure on the elite. The main danger is always co-optation, for instance, and manipulation, and how they can protect and then promote their own interest and agenda. I think that is always a critical challenge. Raymond, you want to say anything?
Well, even within elites, I mean, there are contradictions. It isn't that every part of the elite is a sort of defaulter. Every part of the elite is participating in crony deals. They are large and highly competent and competitive component of the elite who would provide a much better service. And the government would be much better benefited by, in fact, actually operating within a competitive system where these people have a chance. Correspondingly, at other levels, these are all highly productive components of the Bangladesh story, and it is in the interests of the government to, in fact, elevate them and to give them a much better chance. Now, if you are in that small segment of the elite, which is exclusively getting your benefits depending on the size of your default, and also is in fact managing this by getting deals only on the basis of being able to actually get yourself opportunity to inflate the cost of the project and get that. That is something which you will resist, but you are really not a majority even in your own community. And that is my only hope, that at the end, both the state interest and the class interest will in fact coalesce to in fact address the less, you may say, the sort of less participative and the less competent elements who are in fact getting the benefits today.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we, against all expectation, I'm delighted to say that we actually end on time, which is something I have never done for any panel that I have ever been on or ever moderated. So this is a personal first for me. I wanted to say, it just falls to me to say many, many thanks to Ronak and Rahman for these wonderful presentations, from which I think we've learned so much and we've heard so much wisdom. But I think a wonderful blend of realism and still some hope mixed with all of that wisdom and a hard-won experience. So my sincere thanks to you both. That was really wonderful. I love that. I want to apologize to those of you. We had wonderful questions. My thanks to those of you who asked. My apologies to those of you who we didn't get to. I'm sure that these themes will be revisited throughout the course of the conference. And many thanks to the Mittal Center and to Marty Chen, who did such a wonderful job bringing us all together and structuring this so that it worked well, and to Tarun for his leadership with all of this, and to Chelsea and Megan, and to everyone. Many thanks. We're going to now have a break, and we will reconvene with panel 2 promptly at 8:30. Many thanks to everyone.
Thank you from our side to all of you for a well thought out and a very promising event. We're looking to log into the rest of it.
Thank you. ওকে, এখন এটাকে আমি ইয়ে করে দিই, এটাকে আর এটাকেও আমি দাঁড়ান।
Hi, welcome back. I'd like to introduce the moderator of panel number 2.
I can't turn my video on.
All right, we'll turn that on for you.
What's
Panel number 2 is Economic Development from Basket Case to Emerging Economy. And the moderator of this panel is Dr. Lincoln Chen. Hi. Dr. Chen is the President Emeritus of China Medical Board, a Rockefeller Endowed American Foundation. Dr. Chen, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chelsea, and welcome. I'm not sure whether everybody's on, but Marty and I were in Bangladesh at independence, and we've been back ever since on a regular basis. And of course, We saw Bangladesh when it was called a basket case, and also described as overpopulated and poor with no hope for the future. Indeed, we witnessed the 1975 famine when the Brahmaputra River flooded, particularly northern parts of Bangladesh, led to a lot of hunger and death. But obviously, the country is pushed on to becoming a, quote, emerging lower middle income country. So the questions that we're going to focus on with this panel are, has Bangladesh had economic success? And if so, why and how? And then what are the prospects for the future? And I think we should keep in mind the last panel with Professor Rahman Saban and Ronak Jahan, who spoke quite a bit about the social justice dimensions of the economic developments in Bangladesh. But I'm going to offer some brief introductions of the panelists. And their full CVs are available on the website. The first speaker will be Faisal Ahmed, who's a senior economist at the IMF, and he had been a senior advisor to the governor of the Bangladesh Central Bank. The second would be Hussein Zilur Rahman, who is the founding chair of the Power and Participation Research Center in Bangladesh. He's also the chair of BRAC Bangladesh. The third will be Sajida Amin, who is a senior associate at the Population Council. She's undertaken studies of demography, economics, and sociology, especially related to gender and work opportunities. And finally, we have Mushfiq Mubarak Ahmed, who's a development economist, a professor at Yale, whose work has been involved in studying the importance of behavior and technology, and especially poverty reduction. We have altogether 70 minutes. We're going to have an opening round of questions where the panelists have agreed that each will take 4 minutes. And I have my iPhone here that has a little ringer when the 4 minutes are up. So I'll just remind people that 4 minutes are up. And then I've been asked to note that this is a personal academic conversation. So no one is speaking on behalf of their institutions to which they're affiliated. So with that, let me invite Faisal to start.
Good morning, good evening. It's an honor to be part of this panel. Thanks to the Mittal Institute for arranging this. As a child of the 1970s, let me recall the freedom fighters of 1971 who gave their lives so that we can live ours with dignity and freedom. For me, as a macroeconomist, Bangladesh story is a bottom-up story. It's a story of consistent and cumulative progress over the last 5 decades that came from close collaboration between government, people, government, public sector, NGOs, and development partners. Most hearteningly, it's a story powered by women and has been empowering for women. So in 1971, Bangladesh was the most densely populated, as Lincoln mentioned, and the second poorest country in the world. The poorest was Burkina Faso, today's Upper Volta, but that had population of 5 million. And there was perennial fear of famine, flood, and food shortages. Bangladesh's economic progress came despite, and I would argue precisely because of those extreme initial conditions, which gave Bangladesh the focus, the discipline, and the curiosity, at least during the first 3 decades. So looking back, in addition to the hard work by the people and very supportive policies of the government over the decades, 3 macro factors, in my view, drove Bangladesh's economic success. Independence in 1971, our extreme initial conditions, and like many positive economic stories, a dosage of luck and right timing in terms of being part of 2 globalization, one in the 1970s to late 1980s, and another one from 1990s until the global financial crisis. And in my view, we are also very lucky that we didn't have any commodity resources, or we were not a geopolitical flashpoints. During the first 20 years, during the 1970s and 90s through 80s, the first wave of globalization sowed the seeds of manpower, remittance, and garments export. The fear of famine created a focus on food security, agriculture, and population control. Extreme poverty and sufferings invited low-cost solutions in health, education, and famine, thanks to the pioneers of our social innovations. We remember them with honor. The inspiration of 1971 and the desperation of 1970s and 80s gave birth to the innovation, and the pioneers of social innovation themselves were the product of 1971. And I should have mentioned that the economic progress in demographic transition and the fertility through the late 1980s allowed improvement in human development indicators, laying the foundations for the broader takeoff that came in 1990s onwards, when remittance, garments, then agriculture, and I should last mention that the domestic market integration, they both reinforced and amplified each other, reducing poverty. If we look at the last 30 years, and if we think of the relative role the big factors have played, remittance probably played the biggest role in terms of simple arithmetic of the amount of external demand, and then came garments, and remittance, garments, and agriculture. They all touched many lives. Now, where are we now? After 50 years, at our silver jubilee, we have Bangladesh has fed its people. It's, in my view, it's the most bottom-up among the larger economies, and sort of manufacturing-led takeoff. Low value added, yes, low cost and labor intensive, but it has created jobs. But I should mention that as we look ahead, the growth drivers that has supported the first 40 years have been shifting. Since 2012, remittance, garments export, remittance have been actually moderating, is becoming a smaller driver of growth. So there is a shift in the drivers of growth that we need to be mindful. And this is where Professor Sobhan's emphasis on governance becomes extremely important. And looking ahead, as we celebrate the Silver Jubilee, let me part with the quote of Professor Amartya Sen that I really love about Bangladesh's success. He said, Bangladesh's laudable success comes from the fact that it has avoided the twin dangers of inertia and smugness. The future will demand more from these virtues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Faisal, for staying within time. And you gave a very good landscape. Please, Zilor.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to start by saying that where we are now, it's being celebrated around the world and amongst within the country, that from a basket case, an emerging economy, and more future ahead. The first point I want to make is that this was not a planned outcome. Because I think the story of Bangladesh is more an initiative-driven story rather than a policy-driven story. I think that's a foundational feature of Bangladesh's journey we need to keep in mind. And how did this come about? And I think that's where Faisal has touched on it. I'm sure Professor Sobhan also touched on it. 1971 has been seen in many ways, in many aspects, but it had a lasting impact in triggering what I would call a personality revolution in the country. Our people used to be fatalistic. They became aspirational over time. And Bangladesh's journey, this transition from a basket case to emerging economy, it was actually driven by this aspiration, innovations, and of course, policy also played a role. But the initiative-driven part of it is a very foundational feature. I want to, extract 4 lesser-known stories within this transformation journey. First one is about, Bangladesh was defined by as a victim of disasters. And I think the wonderful transformation is that the disaster victim has become the disaster manager. And there are two sort of disasters to refer to. 1970, Bola cyclone, 300,000 deaths. 1998, the flood of the century, deaths restricted to 1,070, and that too mainly from snake bites and drowning. So this disaster victim to disaster manager was a wonderful sort of transition. The second was, and this has not really been commented upon by many, that our first connectivity revolution were the rural feeder roads, which connected the villages and towns and really transformed a rural-urban divide into a rural-urban continuum. And that created the condition for a domestic economy. The rural non-farm sector is a very important part of Bangladesh's economic journey. The third one, of course, is women's agency being unleashed. This wasn't unleashed just by an announcement. I think there were two fundamental descriptions of how this agency was unleashed. One was that, I think this is Sajida's territory to somewhat, the reproductive burden at birth was about 6.3 children per woman. It was reduced to 2.3. And this essentially freed women and transformed them into economic aspirants. It is a fantastic thing that women has gone into garments, women have embraced the microcredit revolution, and women have gone abroad. They are a bulk of the migrants. So this was a third feature. And the fourth is also not very commented upon, is that if you look at our literacy rate, it's still very below 60%. But an illiterate peasantry has embraced the potentials of technology. The transformation, the mechanization of agriculture is one of the lesser told stories of Bangladesh. So this has really been a fantastic transformation, and Bangladesh's transformation actually rests on three pillars, I would say. And that's a slightly different take on the journey. One is, of course, was the usually referred to as the growth drivers, remittance, garments, etc. But an equally important one is the domestic economy, the non-tradable sectors. These trade, services, construction, rural non-farm, they have been, in fact, I calculated that in the last decade, 61% of incremental growth came from this sector. And of course, the third one was the protecting the rear, meaning that Bangladesh really excelled in ensuring food security, and also our safety nets work well. And I think under two working consensus, national consensus worked to try and bring us to this stage. One was famine prevention. I think Lincoln got the date wrong. It wasn't 1975, it was 1974 actually, the famine. And that really triggered a type of response within society that we can never allow famines to happen again in Bangladesh. And we have actually never allowed famines to, whatever have been the disasters. And the other one, which is also a very important one, is that as sort of the change agents have been pluralistic. Market, state, private sector, NGOs, social sector, government. So these two working consensus really underpinned. But now we are at a stage where we are looking ahead. And I think one of the way of thinking that we have to change is that now when we think about Bangladesh, it should not be about where we have come from, but where we want to go. Because we are still caught in that mindset of basket case to emerging economy. But I think we need to now look ahead. And there, certain questions, of course, have emerged. And I just allude to two potential risks. But as I said, it's risks, but Bangladesh, where we will end up, remains open. But I think the human capital agenda remains a very critical agenda. And we are, that remains for me the biggest challenge as Bangladesh enters a new decade. And there, the issue is not only investment. Professor Roman Soban mentioned about governance. I see the governance issue is not just about political governance. It's about this critical variable about human capital and how we resolve that. That is, I think, a critical issue. I will end there and maybe
Thank you. Thank you. So you've got a list here of from victim to manager, gender, rural urban continuum, and the whole question of moving forward with human capital. Well, let's move on to Sajida.
Thank you, Lincoln, and hard act to follow Faisal and Zillur Bhai, but because they've covered a lot of what I would have said. So to pick up on Faisal, I think in terms of thinking about the last 50 years, it is useful to think of the separate periods, distinct periods. Faisal mentioned two kind of pre and post the millennial. I would put a finer point to it. Recalling Sir Abid, I remember he would talk about the agenda for BRAC in terms of 80s was the decade of health and 90s is going to be the decade of education. I'm dating myself by talking about when this conversation took place in the 80s when I first met Sir Abid. And I think going back even before then, both Zillur and Faisal mentioned the importance of recovery, the importance of policies that were never again policies. And I think part of that was an emphasis on population control. Whatever the motivations were, I think it resulted in a very healthy program of family planning after much introspection and reform. But the critical period was the 90s in terms of shifting a focus on education. And all through this, I think the important dimension to note is the centrality of thinking about inclusion of women, thinking about not thinking about women as a footnote to the whole issue of development, but being central to the issue of development. And so it's ironic that when we have this discussion, we still want sort of gender parity in terms of representation, but really we are talking about how to keep women at the center in a context where women don't have that pride of place that in terms of patriarchal values structure that we want to reform and promote. So I think I want to now turn and talk briefly about the trajectory that has happened since the 2000s, which others have not yet mentioned, which is the whole idea of demographic dividend, that we're reaping the benefits of the investments in population, family planning, in health. We've had women's survival, women's life expectancy since the 70s has improved by nearly 25 years. That's phenomenal by any standard. Women live 3 years longer than men. Women live, on average, can expect to live to be 73, men around 70. So I think that basically is an indicator of profound investments in public health in particular, not so much in the rest of the health sector, perhaps. And also there is gender parity in education. So I think these are two factors that have led to eventually, with a slight lag, greater inclusion of women in the economy, which in terms of kind of the demographic dividend story is identified as the critical element of the Asian miracle and how economies that invested in education, economies that invested in human capital were the fastest to grow and to take advantage of this demographic dividend idea. We are at a juncture where we are now at the most favorable level of dependency ratios. And that's because the child dependency ratio is continuing to decline, but the old age dependency ratio is rising. And so we have to think differently about social protection issues, about intergenerational transfers to move forward. I'll end there.
Thank you, Sajida. But let me turn now to Mushfiq. And then when Mushfiq is finished, I'd like to invite the panelists to add another 1 minute if they want to on the comments of the other panelists so that you can speak to each other as well as to the audience. Thank you. Mushfiq.
Okay, thanks very much, Lincoln, for hosting us and for Harvard for organizing and the other panelists. And a lot has been said. I agree with all the comments that Faisal Bhai, Zilur Bhai, Sajida just shared with us. So, I mean, since I teach, maybe what the best I can do is just like weave a narrative that will touch on a lot of the themes that have already come up to help the audience see kind of the picture of how this happened sequentially. And in the end, maybe I'll just add one more factor that hasn't been highlighted as much as I think it should. So yeah, so to weave that narrative, let's start with, let's stay in a celebratory mood of, why is it that we're doing well? It was a basket case, and this has been a good week, and the United Nations just recommended that Bangladesh be graduated out of LDC status. So it's something that we should be celebrating. So now if you look at, okay, why this happened, the proximate causes are, two types of exports. Of course, ready-made garment sector, which accounts for like over 80% of our exports. That's obviously a big part of the story. And the other big export that we have are our other important resource, human beings. And by that I mean remittance, which has always been a large share of our GDP and foreign exchange earnings. Okay? So now why have we been so successful in these two particular sectors, right? I think one important factor, as Sajida highlighted, is female labor force participation has been very, very high. Right? And this is something that explains our success relative to our neighbors, India and Pakistan, right, which started out as much richer countries. You'll see big differences in female labor force participation. All right, so and what's nice about that, people talk about the fact that Bangladesh has a competitive advantage in terms of low wages. Yes, if you can make productive use of half of your population when other countries can't, and that half of the population has relatively few outside options, right? Then of course that's going to give us a competitive advantage, right? But you also need productivity. You need the workforce to be productive. And where does that come from? It comes from the fact that there have been great investments in human capital. So, for example, female school enrollment has been high. That was set. Gender parity in education was set as a goal by the world for 2015 as part of the Millennium Development Goals, right? And Bangladesh achieved that 20 years in advance of that deadline. By mid-1990s, primary school enrollment of girls started exceeding that of boys, right? And it's a goal that many other developing countries are still struggling with. And so that's one aspect of human capital. And I should say that, like, I don't want to argue that it's just that's the cause, right? That's also a consequence. When parents see that, oh, there are factory jobs, there are manufacturing jobs available, they themselves become more likely to put their daughters in school, because now, if your daughter has numeracy literacy skills, they can actually turn that into economic returns, because there are jobs available that reward those skills. And the second thing is that we've plucked a lot of the low-hanging fruit much better than our neighbors in other developing countries. So, like, for example, vaccination rates are very high, right? So very simple reasons for female morbidity, infant mortality, etc. We've done really well in taking away. And why did that happen? So I'm just kind of trying to go back in time to try and understand, like, where the productivity comes from. Okay, so why did that happen? It's that, the government also always played a role, but many other actors did as well. So NGOs, for example, large NGOs like BRAC, but many, many other, hundreds of others working in many different corners of the country, they also did well. And the government's big achievement here was allowing NGOs to operate with minimal interference. Right? And this is something I work in multiple countries, and I run projects often via governments or NGOs. And I've seen that in Bangladesh, it's much easier for us to get things done quickly, efficiently, right, without a lot of interference. Whereas when I go and run the exact same project in Indonesia, it's not possible for us to even have a conversation somewhere in a locality without having central government approval for every step, right? So it allows you to be a lot more nimble. Okay, so I think those are important parts of the story that others have highlighted. Let me just add one more, going back to some comments that Faisal had made earlier, which is about agricultural productivity, right? And I think technology adoption, the Green Revolution, did a lot for us, as it did for the rest of South Asia. So when I was growing up, so in the 80s, I remember on BTV, on Bangladesh television, there were lots of talk shows where we discuss challenges, including like experts coming in the talk shows and talking about food insecurity. We're struggling to feed the 100 million people. The population's projected to increase to 150 million. How on earth will we feed all these people, right? And it's true, the population has increased to 150 or more, right? But food insecurity has not been a concern. And one important reason it hasn't been a concern is that agricultural productivity doubled, or in some areas tripled, where we figured out how to, using drought-resistant varieties of new seeds, we figured out how to take the same plot of land and have 2 or 3 crop cycles. Right? And that's a story, again, of technology adoption. So there were new technologies. The fact that they were invented was important, but the fact that they diffused through the country was also very important. And all of these different social factors that we've been discussing was allowed us to disseminate and diffuse the technology quickly, relatively quickly. And I think that was also important. So we're all celebrating here, which is fantastic. But it's also the case that just because we're telling these positive stories, that there are some important challenges that remain. And I hope for the rest of the panel, we'll be able to turn to those, because we need to look forward and stay on this trajectory and identify the right problems to solve.
Thank you, Mushfiq. And let me just now invite Faisal, Zulur, Sajida, and Mushfiq, if you want to add a 1-minute comment on any of the other speakers. Faisal, you all set?
Yeah. Let me just highlight a point that I touched on last time. For the last 8 to 10 years, the growth drivers in Bangladesh is shifting if you look at the numbers. Export to GDP, remittance to GDP, agricultural productivity has been softening. So if you look at decade in the 2000 to 2010 or 12 versus now, it's much slower now. So that's something, the growth number is shifting, meaning a lot of this growth number is driven by domestic demand. And that, I think, needs to be part of the broader macro conversation. On the topic that Sajida Appa, Mushfiq, and Hussein Bhai mentioned, I think that on health and education, we have done well. But if we look at India spends 50% more than on health and education than us, Vietnam three times more. So at the stage we are in now, there is significant ramp up. That's where the fiscal revenue will come. When you have the highest growth rate in the world, we have the lowest tax to GDP ratio in the world. So we are in a sort of a cross current. As we celebrate the graduation from LDC, it's going to be very challenging uphill.
Zulur. Can't hear.
You're on mute.
Sorry about that. I want to touch again on the issue of human capital in education. I think that's, we have done well, and everyone has recognized that we have done the investment and all that. But if I take the 50-year sort of perspective, education used to be the driver of social mobility in Bangladesh. Today, quality divide in education is the key driver of inequality. That's a sort of a type of transformation which we need to factor in. So when we talk about our education attainment, I think it's now important to unpack between primary, secondary, and tertiary. Particularly in secondary education, the pre-workforce phase, there the quality issue is very, very critical, and even the public investment there is actually is a great question mark. Quality, and the quality issue is not just an investment issue. I think the education as a whole, I have a sense that we may be focusing too much on the earlier decades in terms of where we are regarding the human capital agenda. We really need to take a hard look at what are the new challenges. And the challenges are not to be solved by the way we did the, getting children into school. World Bank has come up with this idea of that schooling is not equivalent to learning. I mean, you can have schooling of 12 years, but learning of 5 or 6 years. And I think Abed Bhai, for Hassan Abed, who played a role in getting, focusing on educational access at the beginning of his career, really later we'll begin to focus on this issue of quality, which is a critical one. And I think going ahead, this is what will determine whether we do break out of the so-called middle income trap.
Thank you. Please, Sajida.
Yeah, so the one thing that we haven't really mentioned, and it's going to loom large in our horizon, is urbanization. We're going to be 50% urban, but we still talk and think about Bangladesh as essentially a rural economy, because our identity, our peasant identity, as Ronak talked about, is essentially that. And I think we need to think not as a divided world, rural and urban Bangladesh, but what are the connectivities there? I think a lot of issues around remittance, around maintaining a rural base is fundamental to our Bangladeshi value system that we need to embrace and celebrate. But we also need to think about this very quickly, because not just Dhaka, but the entire country is urbanizing at an extremely rapid rate, and nothing of what we talk about, whether it's education or health, actually fully takes into account what's happening in urban areas.
Thank you. Please, Mushfiq.
Yeah, so I'm glad Sajida mentioned this, because I mean, we're now segueing into thinking about some of the new challenges of like urbanization is going to be one. Let me just make a observation around what the four of us did. Like we all each, did not discuss this in advance. We talked about what the drivers of growth were, and a little bit of a worrying thing is that we all came up with the exact same things. Right? We just heard the same thing over and over. And why that worries me is that means that maybe lack of diversification, if we can all identify just 1 or 2 or 3 factors as underlying drivers, right? Then lack of diversification may be a challenge that we need to grapple with, right? If all of us talk about remittances and migrants and garments, right? That's actually something to worry about.
Okay, well, it seems like all of you have started turning the leaf to the next question, which I would ask you to give 2 minutes to, which is, what are the prospects for the future, and especially the questions of sustainability and with social justice in the economic portfolios as it unfolds? Please proceed. Faisal, 2 minutes, okay?
I think there is good momentum. Couple of things have happened. There is a certain industrial base, there is an industrial class, farmers and the economies are much more connected. And I also feel that Bangladesh has a unique advantage, which I like to call it density dividend, basically the proximity of people that has helped social innovation, market integration, diffusion of ideas, quite unique in many ways. Building on Sajida, I feel that Bangladesh is growing from the largest village in the world in the 1970s, so sort of largest city in the world. Messy, but that was my impression after going back working there for some time. So I think that challenge is going to be, how do we move, as Mushfiq also meant, how do we diversify, and also the technology use, because technology is shifting this low value added garments manufacturing. I think there is a big paradigm. So that's something we will need to focus on. I think what we need, if we want to leverage domestic demand to grow, Bangladesh will need 2 engines. It's not going to be like Southeast Asia that has happened in the previous decades. So those 2 things I would say, and for many of this education investment, we can't do any of those unless we significantly ramp up our capacity of the state, revenue of the state, efficiency and quality of the expenditure. So I think there is a good example of large infrastructure investment that we have done in last 10 years, but we need to do how efficiently we're doing. In power sector, there is a large increase in capacity, but 50% of this is remaining sort of unutilized. So this sort of large infrastructure and also the infrastructure investment. How do we improve the quality of expenditure? Because that will determine the quality of health, education, all the public services. We have entered the phase of public quality perfect services. Without that, the middle income transition is very difficult. So I think we have success to be confident, but what we need is a lot more openness and humility. Thank you.
Thank you. Zulur.
Yeah. Well, I think the most important resource for Bangladesh in the next phase 2 will be its innovative spirit and its aspirational citizenry. I mean, I am particularly not too concerned about which type of sectors might come forth. We didn't know about government really coming forth as a key driver. It did come. People took out the opportunity. So I see the two areas where we need to really focus. One, again, I come back to the human capital issue, because there is this statistics, which is 30% of the youth are not in employment, education, or training. So you have, on the one hand, this issue about we have the MDG attainments, but the SDG educational goals are of a different order, actually. So unless we get the human capital agenda right, and Sajida mentioned the demographic dividend window, and that's just another decade, actually, essentially. And critical there is the governance issue. And I think here I will connect this to my final point, which is that what has underpinned Bangladesh's journey so far was a working consensus across society of pluralistic sort of initiative space. You know, market, private sector, government, NGOs, social actors could work as they found opportunities. And there has been a sort of in the last decade, there has been a sort of a transformation in that reality, where there has been, for example, I would say that certain key sectors of the economy seem to have now set with entry barriers. And you have a sort of a problem about the competitive opportunities being curtailed. I think we really need to really focus on this. And also the social space. You know, nevertheless, as I said, Bangladesh's future is going to be determined by 3 factors. One is innovations, one is aspirations, and the third is economic governance. The first 2 remain abundant in supply. The second one, you know, is evolving over time. And if I see the 5 decades, I would see 2 decades as 2 of these 5 decades as the turning points. You know, the 90s where we really began to take off in multiple indicators. But the last decade, you know, in certain way, the growth elasticity of the poverty has gone down. And as I said, the human capital agenda is in a certain reality, and we seem to be stagnating on the tax GDP ratio context. Even private investment has been stagnating. So we have to really get these 2 out. In that sense, the challenge as we go forward, that in the last 5 decades, initiatives really brought us this far. But in the next 2 decades, initiatives and governance have to work even more closer together if you are to reap the benefits. And I think Bangladesh people are ready to make the next change in their journey. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, Sajida.
Mute.
We can't hear, but Mushfiq, yeah, please go ahead.
One is on the question of human capital. I completely agree that we need skills, we need some way of marrying skills with technology, but we really haven't cracked the code on how to skill. I think some of the old models of skills training, specific sectoral ones, have clearly been shown not to work. What has been shown to work in limited ways is the whole question of soft skills, particularly with regard to women and women's success in economic terms. The other that's a much bigger headache for me, and I think it should be for Bangladesh, and we have not mentioned at all, is kind of the negative driver of climate change, particularly from the coastal belt, the component of migration that is not so positively driven by the need for a better future, seeking a better future, but only in the sense of being pushed off the land. And I think unless we crack that code of how you address climate adaptation and how you address transformative adaptation, we are really not going to sustain this growth trajectory that we are celebrating today.
Thank you. Mushfiq.
Yeah, and again, I'll have to draw on a lot of things that have been mentioned, but I'd like to think about the challenges and how to address them. So the one big challenge, and I'll use the same words that the other panelists have used, like diversification, innovation, governance, urbanization, etc. Okay. So the first challenge is that this year has made it very, very clear to us that diversification is important, because some shocks are aggregate shocks, like there's a global pandemic that can actually wipe out an entire industry, right? It's not just about wiping out a particular factory. It's like there can be disruptions that say that if you rely on one particular thing, it can just get wiped out. Just as an example, right? If this pandemic happened to be, if the virus happened to be a little bit more contagious, right? It would have stopped all types of cross-border movement, right? And if you rely on just migrants and remittances, that's a big shock. It would have, as happened early in March 2020, it could lead to huge disruptions in the flow of particular goods like textiles and ready-made garments, right? Because that's not the first thing that people are in people's minds when how I'm going to buy clothes. Okay? So that means that diversification is going to be really important, and this year underlines why. Okay. So how do you diversify? You do need to move into new sectors. That means innovation, a word that Zilur used, is really important. Okay, but here I want to warn my fellow citizens that you cannot innovate well if people don't have freedom of expression. Right, those two things go hand in hand. Right, people need to have the freedom to think about new ideas, to actualize new ideas. Right, and if you want to expand the frontier, if you want to create new products and new markets, right? People need to feel safe that their ideas will be protected, that their thoughts will be protected, that they can express them freely, that the intellectual property, their physical property will be protected, right? They need that safety, okay? And so our country also needs to resist these authoritarian temptations that have mired other countries in traps, right? If we really are going to take the next step. And this is a point that's made, not just about Bangladesh, but even a country as impressive as China. Right? If you want to start expanding the frontier, right? Commentators on China say that you need to move to a different type of intellectual regime that allows people to express themselves. And competition also matters for innovation. And if competition matters, then you actually need to allow people to compete in the marketplace of ideas, right? That means having a free media that questions policies, right? These are extremely important. And these are some of the worries that I have about the country that we are increasingly seeing pushes towards silencing. And that's not, even if you just care about economic growth, that is not the right strategy. Okay. I'll stop there.
Okay, well, I'm going to pose 3 questions from the audience to the panel, and please feel free to choose any 1 or 2 or 3 of them in your quick responses of hopefully less than 1 minute. The first relates to the female garment workers, which is the importance of their rights and wages, and how can they be protected, because they're obviously at risk. The second relates to the farmers and the can government and social institutions better support growing family-based small-scale farming efforts? And the third relates to the human capital, which is what does a governing class need to do in order to fire up the imagination of younger people in the country to stay and return from higher studies abroad?
So I can talk a little bit about the returning from higher studies abroad.
you're one that has not returned yet thus
Yes.
far, right?
Yes, exactly. So now so in order to, especially given, this is related to the comments I was just making about innovation, right? Any country to be successful, especially if it's trying to move the frontier, right, has to both retain talent or attract talent, right? This is also true for countries like the United States. Even though it has built up some of the finest institutions in the world, it's not that that the education system within the United States where I now live is producing all the talent. We still rely on global talent and the ability to attract that talent, right? So how do you retain talent? This goes back to a comment that Sajidapa made earlier. It's about, think it's related to urbanization. You need to make a place livable, okay? And so that requires infrastructure investment. That requires what I was talking about, freedom to allow people to earn returns off of their ideas and off of their innovations, right? And if people don't feel comfortable that I will earn an economic return, there's no policy that can, force people to stay back, right? And that wouldn't be the right policy anyway.
Good. Okay, please, anyone else want to tackle one of these three questions?
All right, I just on two of the agriculture and the government workers. On the government workers, it touches on a bigger issue. Their rights are not limited to the right wages in the factory. They are urban citizens. And therefore, as urban citizens, they should have rights to appropriate healthcare and appropriate educational opportunities. And this is a problem, what Sajida and others were mentioning about urbanization, that with regard to the urban poor, we haven't really, which is a very growing large category of people, we are looking at them only as economic actors. But as citizens, urban citizens who also need health and education facilities and rights, that is a big hole actually. And here, I think that's another transition that we may have to make. If you look at the type of progress we made on social sector, health and education, these came about through what I would call a campaign type of approach. We haven't really done well on system building approach. We have got the children into school, but we couldn't improve teaching environment. We got child mortality down, but hospital care is actually and out-of-pocket expenses cross 70% of the total expense. So in the future, this is going to be a big issue. And with regard to governments, I think we touch it with other urban poor also. We need a very great rethink about the health and education infrastructure, which is also accessible to the poor. Regarding agriculture, I'll just make a quick comment about the small farmers. They have been the drivers of whatever transformation is Bangladesh done. But I think from a policy mindset, even from an academic mindset, Bangladesh has looked at agriculture not as a growth driver, but as a security on the issue of food security. That's a guarantee of food security. So the type of public investment which are necessary to transform agriculture also into growth driver is a new agenda. And I think we need to push it, both the government, certainly, but even the academic world also needs to really reimagine agriculture not as the backward sector of yesterday, but a potential growth driver of tomorrow. That's a mindset transformation, I think, for which Bangladesh is now ready. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Sajid, do you want to make any comments about the future?
Yeah, so I think one way I would respond to the question about the rights of government workers is to, again, go back to the question of soft skills. I think the main way, when we look at the life histories of government workers, the main way they improve on their wages is people who have negotiating skills, who can jump from job to job. That's basically the only trajectory for wage improvement in the garment sector. So I think the ability to develop soft skills and the ability in particular to develop these negotiating skills is critically important for the garment sector, for their work, productivity and their returns, but also for to be able to have these benefits spill over to other sectors of life, because those are skills that are transferable across different spaces.
Good. Well, I would like to offer at this point, because we've got about 10 minutes left, I think. You've got 8 minutes left. But would any of you like to make a final comment about the future? Particularly, I'm impressed, Faisal, with the lack of infrastructure, particularly the roads and power in Bangladesh, and how that is going to be an enabler or a block. I'm also impressed, Sajida, with your comment about climate change and how that might affect especially the southern portions of the country. I'm impressed, Zilur, about your emphasis on human capital, but especially the more advanced skills, not just basic literacy, but the more advanced skills. Mushfiq, I'm impressed by your comments about the need for diversification and freedom, essentially, freedom for innovation in the future. But would you like each to make a 1-minute final summation comment about what do you think is the most important aspect of the future of the Bangladesh economy? Faisal?
Let me just go ahead. I think I would just again touch back on some of the challenges. I think the macro story, I cannot overemphasize. The macro story in Bangladesh is shifting very rapidly. We have to go beyond the growth numbers. What is even the drivers of the growth with the change in technology, climate change in the next decade or so. This is something I think that I cannot overemphasize, the state capacity. State capacity, governance, governance in the financial sector, governance in the fiscal sector. And I think there we are far behind to some of the other previous takeoffs. Our story is at a critical juncture point, and that we should take the celebration of the last 50 years, use that confidence to look at us more critically and with openness, as something that Mushfiq has highlighted. Thank you.
Thank you. Zulur.
Yeah. Well, I'll sum up in a different way, in the sense that, the middle income dream has been a powerful mobilizational sort of tool. But what I see that we can talk about, certainly we have to talk about these particular features of the economy. But Bangladesh has, the people found out solutions where there were difficulties, constraints. We need to allow people to have a say in this, finding the solutions. And that's where I feel that one of the key thoughts I want to leave this discussion with is that perhaps the most important agenda for us now is that we need to democratize the middle income dream. We need to make sure the middle income dream is not being dreamt by any particular group in a particular way. We need to allow the different dreamers to have their say in how this dream, and from that, the appropriate action agendas will follow. Thank you.
Thank you. Sajida.
Hi, so I'm going to be a Debbie Downer a bit and talk about one of the central challenges in my mind is captured in the indicators of sexual and gender-based violence. We have the dubious distinction of having some of the highest rates of reported intimate partner violence in the world, and according to the data. We also have the dubious distinction of having the highest rates of child marriage in Asia, and only 4th in the world. And I think these are issues that that are linked to security. That's less of a proven connection, but I believe while we can expand this whole notion of security, the security space, to and focus on these indicators, and then dial back to the question of gender and how we have or have not truly included women in the whole agenda on development.
Thank you. Mushfiq.
Yeah, maybe I'll summarize with one word is livability of the place. So something that shows up in a variety of ways from all the panelists' comments, right? Which is that like going forward, right? You want, in order to continue to succeed, you want your talent and your citizens to be in a place where they're very happy to live, right? So how does it relate to lots of other comments that have been made? So this means investment in infrastructure is critical. You're going to be happy to live in a place where you feel like you have secure access to water, to electricity, to basic needs like that, right? And we've made impressive progress. The government should be commended for making impressive progress in investing in power generation, right? But there are some other challenges that remain. It's related to migration, urbanization as well. Cities become unlivable if there's lots and lots of people moving in, and we are not making the required investments in housing, safe housing, access to sanitation, access to water, and things like that, right? A place is livable also if you feel like you can, use your talent to earn a return, right? And so if there's, and then this dream, democratizing the dream that Zilur talked about, right? If you feel like you're in a country where who you're born as, who you're connected to, is what determines whether you can dream or not, right? That's not a good place to be. We're going to lose talent that way, right? And so increased livability and like thinking about the challenges of urbanization is something that I would highlight.
Thank you very much. We've had a lively panel. I take away from this that the last 50 years, Bangladesh success has come from bottom up. It's come from the enterprise and energy and creativity of its people. And it's not been top down or centrally controlled completely, though the question of how much it empowers and enables the democratic dreams that is necessary for a democratic middle class, middle income country, I think is a challenge. The human capital and education Bangladesh is going to be a very different kind of middle income country. It's going to be a continuum from rural to urban. The whole country is urbanizing essentially because of the population size and also the infrastructure that's being put in place. So I think I'm impressed with the global warming and climate change challenges in Bangladesh. But I take away from all of this that Bangladesh people are very, very smart. And the Bengali culture has a power to both unite and to encourage innovation, which may not be found in all societies. So for bringing and highlighting all of that, I want to thank Faisal and Zulur and Sajida and Mushfiq for a lively panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now we'll move into a 10-minute break.
Thanks very much, Lincoln. You did a masterful job of keeping things on time and weaving people in and out of the conversation. Thanks very much.
Yeah, but it might have been a little bit too abrupt. But anyways.
No, not at all.
I'm glad you're on time.
Hi all and welcome back. We have up next panel number 3, which is human development and defying the odds. Before I turn it over to our moderator today, Dr. Richard Cash, I'm just going to give a quick update on his biography. Dr. Cash and his colleagues conducted the first clinical trials of oral rehydration therapy, or ORT, in adult and pediatric cholera patients and patients with other infectious causes of diarrhea at the Cholera Research Laboratory in Bangladesh. Other in-country studies included the first field trials and community-based trials of ORT and the use of amino acids as an additional substrate. He was the principal investigator of the Applied Diarrheal Disease Research Project, a program that assisted developing country scientists to hone their research skills by conducting their own research projects. Over 150 studies involving more than 350 investigators were funded in 12 countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, leading to over 275 publications. Research priorities included behavioral studies of caretakers and providers, foods and fluids, prevention of diarrhea, persistent diarrhea, and acute respiratory infection and nutrition. Dr. Cash also directed a program in research ethics that focused on training for fellows from Asia and research ethics workshops at HSPH and in 12 countries. He's the senior editor of Casebook on Ethical Issues in International Health Research, a WHO publication. Dr. Cash, I'd like to turn it over to you. Thanks so much for moderating today.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very kind introduction. It's a pleasure, really a pleasure to be here. I've been, as Chelsea has mentioned, I've been connected with Bangladesh now for 53 years and was there, of course, during the time that Ayub fell, and then when the cyclone left just before the cyclone and returned shortly within a month after the liberation of the country. So this is and have maintained a long history with the country, coming back every year or two, every year actually since that time. So it's a great pleasure to be back and to participate in this wonderful symposium. What I'd like to do is to briefly introduce the panel, and then we've set up a few questions, and I've asked each of the participants, 3 of them, to give up to 10 minutes discourse on their concept of human development. I will then address a few other questions to them, and then we'll open the floor up for discussion. So I hope that meets with all of your expectations. So the panel consists of Dr. Wahiuddin Mahmood, who is a retired professor of economics at the University of Dhaka. He's authored and co-authored numerous books. I'm not going to name them, but he has led the economic advisory panels for 4 successive 5-year plans and the perspective plan of the government of Bangladesh. He has his PhD from Cambridge University. Our second participant is Dr. Imran Mateen, who is the executive director of the BRAC Institute of Governance and Development, and which is a research and postgraduate educational institution at BRAC University. It generates a number of high quality evidence and insights based on field research. Prior to his current role, Imran worked with Save the Children and International and Innovations for Poverty Action. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Sussex in the UK. And our final participant is Kamrul Islam, who began his career in the health services in Bangladesh, serving in the directorate of the Health Planning Commission. He served in leadership and managerial positions nationally and internationally in Bangladesh and Africa, and has recently assumed the role of the regional director of South Asia of Water Aid after 11 years of serving as the country representative. He's contributed to the formation of the National Health Policy and National Population Policy of Bangladesh as a member of the drafting committee, and is one of the organizers of the upcoming publication on the health sector, which marks 50 years of independence. Now, some of the questions that we have proposed to the panel are as follows. Bangladesh has done well on key development indicators. Which ones do you think are the most significant, and which indicators has the progress been less good? What factors do you think have contributed to human development miracle in health and education particularly, and what are the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead? So I'm going to get off the stage here and turn it over to our learned panelists. Wahideen, would you like to start out, please? Thank you. And try to keep your remarks to 10 minutes or less. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Remind me when it's 10 minutes. I shouldn't want to exceed. Good morning and good evening. We know that Bangladesh has performed unexpectedly well in achieving economic growth. Its per capita GDP growth has been way ahead of the average of developing countries since 1990s. But improvements in social development indicators since 1990s was even more remarkable, particularly in infant and child mortality rate reduction, reducing fertility rate, female school enrollment, with female advantage across all income groups in secondary and primary education. And cross-section country studies show that in all these indicators, Bangladesh was a laggard. From laggard, it has become a leader. And it is true of also of the contributing factors like contraceptive adoption, child immunization, oral saline adoption for diarrhea treatment, female employment. All these are underlying contributing factors. In all these, Bangladesh was a laggard and has become a leader. There are two remarkable things about this achievement. First is that Bangladesh achieved this in spite of very low spending, public social spending on health and education, both in per capita terms and in terms of percent of GDP. Second, Bangladesh's gains have been there in spite of very poor governance in public service delivery, both in terms of absentees of teachers, absentees of doctors in school education. That's what's called Bangladesh's development surprise. But I myself, having been alleged to have coined this term Bangladesh surprise, I have to admit that I feel now a bit somewhat my enthusiasm is a bit muted. That's because we were slow to detect Bangladesh's achievements when these were happening. At the same time, we are also slow in detecting that some of the progress achievements in indicators are now a bit stagnant or even reversing during since 2013. But I'm sure that we shall have strategies to compensate that. About the contributing factors, how Bangladesh did that at such low public spending and poor governance of service delivery. One is well known that we took the advantage of low-cost solutions with effective social campaigns in terms of, in respect of oral saline for diarrhea treatment, child immunization, social marketing of contraceptives. The spread of these ideas was easy because of lack of remoteness in Bangladesh, which is because of density of population and also extensive rural networks. And involvement of NGOs helped a lot. And lastly, but not least, willingness of Bangladeshis, even poor people, to adopt affordable new ideas whenever those are given to them. I mean, it was shown in when even the poor farmers adopted HIV rice cultivation earlier than richer farmers. Of course, some government interventions worked well. Girls' stipend program is known as one of the vanguard of conditional cash transfer. Then government's emphasis on early emphasis on population control and rural lower network. If you ask me, you asked me, one of the question was what was the best achievement and where Bangladesh is lagging. The answer to that, I will say that you see, it's very difficult to identify a single most successful achievement, because all these indicators, they're part of a social transformation where there were unanticipated synergies. Say, for example, door-to-door family planning services helped, of course, helped unmet demand for contraceptives, but it had a byproduct of catalyst for middle-class professional family planning workers coming out of home. That led to very rapid female employment outside home, and then the NGOs and MFIs gave a platform for the women to get together, and there was contraceptive adoption and reduced fertility. Along with that, the child mortality reduction was helped by the, as I said, immunization program and oral saline. And all this social transformation helped parental attitude towards investing in children's education and family. Having all that, the challenge is that these were low-hanging fruits, and all these were successful social campaigns which in a way bypassed the government's main health infrastructure, which is ridden with dysfunctional governance system. Quality of education remains a problem. So the challenge would be now how to the further progress in any of these indicators will require more social spending. Because if you want to reduce maternal mortality or child mortality more, you will need more interventions, hospital-based interventions, which will require more costly interventions and better health service. And also in education, if you cannot improve the quality of education, school enrollment is there, but unless there is quality of education which gives employable skills, then there will be a problem of dropouts, which already dropouts are increasing in schools. And the main problem is that Bangladesh has one of the lowest revenue mobilization as a percentage of GDP in the region or even among all developing countries. So you mentioned that I was involved in the preparation of the 6th, 7th, 8th 5-year plan. We have the difficulty in resource balancing. The gap was there when it was in terms of public financing of health and education. Unless we do that, we may progress more in terms of health and education outcomes with increasing per capita income, but that will mean that the proportion of out-of-pocket expenditure on health will be increasing, which has been increasing over time, and the outcome will be far less unequal than it has been now. Bangladesh has been blessed with not only having these achievements so far, but also that these achievements have been quite equitable. That's because the interventions were at the level of even poor families and using the agency of poor women instead of taking the agency of local governance and local communities, which also has created one anomaly. I shall end by saying that Bangladesh has done so much by using female agency and achieving in the social development outcomes which are more to do with females, girl education, contraceptive adoption and all that. In spite of that, there is the anomaly that Bangladesh has done so badly in some of the community-based welfare indicators like age at marriage, violence against women, dowry, and all that. That's because the way we have achieved all this, not through the agency of the community, which Kerala did, but through the agency of interventions at the individual level of individual poor households. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a lovely summary, and we have much to build on. Imran, let me turn to you and ask you for your comments.
Great, thank you. It's always very difficult after Waidul Mahmood sir because of his comprehensive treatment. I'm going to focus on education, which obviously is a key area of human development and human capital formation. I'll try and talk more about the human capital formation aspect of education, rather than the more philosophical and citizenry-based understanding of education, which is of course critical as well. And I hope we can get to some of those interconnections later in the discussion. Now, I mean, sort of, we all know that in terms of enrollment and in terms of even retention, I think we have done quite well. I think the gender dimension of these strides that Bangladesh has made is of particular importance to really understand and unpack better. I think the gender equality that we have achieved even in enrollment in primary and secondary, I think needs more analytical unpacking than we have done until now. But we have done really good in that aspect. Even in terms of retention, we're still, the progress has been there. It's stalling a bit, but I think there's been really good progress. And I think the female secondary stipend program has been a big contributor with respect to the sort of closing the gender gap in terms of retention in particular. However, it is. I mean, this is also very well known that our learning to grade completion curve is extremely flat. So irrespective of your grade progression, your level of learning that you basically have in terms of your literacy, numeracy, in whatever way you choose to measure those, are fairly flat. So every incremental grade completion doesn't really lead to much learning outcome. What that basically means is that return to education is also sort of quite low, which in turn, kind of, I think, creates, disincentives also for retention sort of as well. So there is a kind of a trap there in terms of low quality of education, low return to education, leading to greater demand for continuation, especially at higher levels. That's exactly where some of the vulnerabilities around child marriage starts creeping in, and sort of other forms of not so productive engagement starts sort of creeping in. So quality of education is sort of clearly a critical area that we need to work on. Now, just to give you one statistics, a recent UNESCO report basically says that around 58% of 10-year-olds were found incapable of reading or understanding a simple text by the end of their primary school. So this is, and there's lot more statistics in this regard. So why this is the case, I'll just and why this is so difficult. And I think this is primarily difficult not because we do not know what works, not because we do not know what does not work, but because the politics of learning and the governance of learning is very, very challenging. The politics of expanding schools, the politics of construction, the politics of recruitment of teachers, providing books, all of those are more visible and creates all kinds of opportunities for rent seeking, which basically sort of means you don't have to deal with the crux of some of the governance challenges with respect to performance and accountability. So that lies at the heart of why quality of education improvement is of sort of particular challenge. What is also interesting is some of the local governance mechanism at the local level, which is school management committees we have at the primary and the secondary level. These seem to be fairly functional. However, their impact in terms of holding teachers to account is not particularly strong. So they are quite active in many, many ways because these are very important forum with respect to political control. These are very important forum with respect to political rent seeking and other types of rent seeking of all types. So they function, they are active, yet they fail to exert any kind of pressure on teachers' accountability and ultimately learning. So I think this is the biggest sort of challenge, and perhaps in some of the conversation later we can basically come to it. Now, in terms of interventions that work with respect to quality of education, I think that is also fairly well known. I mean, we know that providing learning books don't really help learning. They're important, they don't help learning. Increasing teachers' salary is important, but it does not improve learning. Setting up school toilets are very important. They do not have any impact on learning. What works in terms of learning is ultimately training teachers and holding teachers to account. We know that teaching at right level, this is a very, very evidence, there's large scale evidence with respect to teaching at right level, teaching students at the right level works. And I think we need to really focus on some of these interventions, but I think it's sort of primarily a political economy and a politics challenge that we need to have serious conversation on at the national level. And I think some of the possibilities are there. Now, whether we turn them into actual, realize them or not is sort of another whole question, and whether we can create a national consensus and momentum around it. But I think some of the basic political conditions may actually be there, and I think we may want to come to this conversation sort of later. The second area is in terms of the higher education beyond primary and secondary, is that these higher education are, I think this has been talked about before, many of these higher education degrees are, where the employability skills are not really focused on. Especially, I think this is of particular importance in terms of relatively lower return higher education degrees, which may be important for other reasons. But I think employability skills are of particular importance for those type of lower return higher education programs. And of course, we need to think of other associational degrees, such as around professional degrees, as attractive choices and alternatives to higher education. Unless we address these, what we end up with is this, what we call NEET, which is not in employment, education, or training. Now, this is growing. 15 to 30-year-old NEET right now, according to the latest figure, is 30%. And 50% of women are in NEET. 8% of men are in NEET. So there's a big gender disparity in NEET as well. So one of the way we approach the NEET challenge is by addressing higher education challenge head on, with a focus on employability skills, embedding employability skills, and also making other associational degrees equally attractive by incentivizing them, by making them attractive for as sort of alternatives. So that's with respect to higher education. Finally, I just want to also talk very quickly about the looming digital divide, and I think this is absolutely clear, especially on the sort of during the COVID crisis, and I think this is something we need to pay great attention. Education as a great equalizer with the looming digital divide on access, with respect to access and effective usage, is increasingly becoming and can really become a great divider in terms of our society. And that's something we need to pay attention to. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Imran. Lastly, let me turn to Khairul Islam and ask you, sir, to comment on the issue of human development, especially in the health sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I will be using two terms. One is miracle, which happened in the health sector in human development. The other is paradox. We have been discussing about the miraculous part for quite a long time in a self-satisfying way, but we haven't been discussing about paradox in that critically until the COVID actually surfaced out many of those lacunas. But when we look back almost 50 years down the memory lane, we also must actually highlight a few issues related to miracle and how it happened. When the life expectancy at birth was added in the Human Development Index, that was one of the main indicators that about which we feel proud of, that in 1971, we started with 46.5 years, which was 2 years below India figure and probably almost 6 to 7 years below Pakistan figure. And after 50 years, we are almost 2 years ahead of India and more than 5 years ahead of Pakistan. And Professor Wahiduddin Mahmood have already mentioned about number of things where we have done well. But usually, I mean, we do not cite a few examples which are covered in primary healthcare. One is the essential drugs that in 1982, because of the drug policy right now, we have got $2 billion pharmaceutical industry, which is also exporting medicine in a number of countries. And the country could enjoy reasonable priced medicine for the last 40 years or so. And the other is the tremendous improvement in water sanitation and hygiene, which ultimately contributed in a way in child mortality by reducing diarrhea in a number of ways. The contributing factor that I would like to highlight is our independence. In 2013, when the Lancet series on Bangladesh got published, during that analytical period, we realized that the war of independence and independence itself had tremendous effect on shaping and forming the health sector in Bangladesh. And just to give a few realistic examples, in 1971, right after liberation of the country, when we had to deal 300,000 plus raped cases, we had to waive the ban on abortion. And that led to Bangladesh, one of the first Muslim country to liberalize, and in the name of menstrual regulation, number of improvement in the family planning program we have started seeing. In the same manner, if you recall, you yourself was one of the discoverer of oral rehydration salt. In 1971, in the refugee camp, when it was massively used during those cholera epidemic, and right after that, during in the Bangladesh, how BRAC popularized it, and till now, almost 50 million children all over the world were saved just by the simple solution of ORS. If we recall during those war days, the makeshift hospital, the way it was resourced by common people, students, nurses, its impact actually carried forward in the health system in terms of how we resourced our frontline health workers who ultimately worked in the field of family planning. He worked in promoting expanded program on immunization, and you name all those public health intervention about which we are feeling proud of. And that ultimately led to 1978 Alma-Ata Conference and Declaration on Primary Healthcare, where this kind of primary healthcare issues, which is actually direct offset of, output of the liberation war, actually contributed in norming and forming our health system. The number of wounded freedom fighters actually led to formation of institutions like, this what we call Pongo Hospital, CRP, and things like that. The other important factor I see as resilience of people. If we recall the life saved and the way we managed number of natural disasters in Bangladesh and the way it progressed, is mainly the resilience of people and the public health professionals of the front line who actually contributed in saving those lives immediately after those disasters. And disaster management in Bangladesh has become a role model in the other part of the world. So the impact of the independence war and this resilience of people, I find, are two direct contributors in forming and shaping Bangladesh's health system. But the point where I see the paradox comes is pluralism in the health sector. Because from the beginning, we allowed so many sectors to grow, so many private sectors to flourish, so many unregulated vendors of medicine to spread all over the country, those might have contributed in saving lives. But after a number of years, we have started feeling that unregulated pluralistic health system ought to cause certain hegemony, which we have seen during this COVID period. That 250,000 vendors of medicine were open when most of the public health system and private health system were not offering services, but simultaneously the way they sell antibiotics, the way they misuse some of the things, the way they prompted poor people to spend disproportionately of their income behind quality of care, per episode of treatment cost is getting increased and increased. And this is one of the reasons where we see that out-of-pocket expenditure in this country is increasing exponentially. Few years ago, it was in and around 2/3 of the of the total expenditure. Now, in 2020, it has gone up to 74%, more than Pakistan and India and all other neighboring countries. So how we manage those, that's something that I find as a paradox, and that needs to be managed by regulating those pluralistic health systems. Let me stop here, and if I get time, probably during question and answer, I will reflect more on some of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think all of you have certainly stuck to time, and also you've raised some interesting questions. Let me let me take a few minutes to ask a few questions here, and then we'll open it up. You mentioned, Khairul, this notion that this privatization issue has come up. Imran, you talked about the quality of education, and Wahideen, you also mentioned this idea that we have Bangladesh has managed to pick off the low-lying fruit, as we say, but sometimes stresses on the system bring out the issues, and one of these, of course, has been the COVID pandemic. Do you think that what has that exposed in terms of fault lines and also positive elements in terms of human development and what Bangladesh may need in the future? And let me start with you, Khairul, since we started with Wahideen in the beginning. What is your observation on this? Try to keep you guys, your remarks not too long. I won't set a time.
During COVID time, what we realized is that our curative service, which is the treatment facility, has become over the past few years or decades so much privatized that at this moment, twice the bed are in private sector, like 55,000 beds are in public sector and 110,000 plus are in the private sector. So when private sector was denied to offer services, there was a collapse, and people were going door to door, and hospitals were not were not admitting anyone. People, there are a number of pathetic incidences where patient died within the ambulance. Now, what it really entails is that the difference between a public health system, meaning a health system run by the government, and the health system, which is a national health system, the policymakers who are sitting in the Ministry of Health, they consider the government-run health system is their lookout. The national health system, whose lookout, it's not in their thinking paradigm. That's where the main dilemma is coming, and the paradox that I was referring to is coming out of that inadequate and lack of thinking. That so the national health system and government-run health system, they cannot encompass government and private, both together constitutes the overall national health system. That idea and comprehension is not present in the policymaker's mind, or maybe present but not adequate enough to serve the people.
Imran, what do you see, and certainly in education or in other sectors? The stresses that were put up by this system, and much, of course, of education is also privatized, as you know.
No, I think one of the most lasting and the most difficult recovery that we're going to be facing is with respect to the human capital recovery. With respect to COVID, I think we are actually seeing quite good recovery in sort of the overall economic sectors. We've been lucky with respect to the sort of the health part of it, the infection part of it, but with respect to the education sector and the human capital recovery, I think this is going to be the most lasting impact, not the direct impact only. Of course, the schools being closed, the direct impact of that, but it is the pre-existing inequities that I think will get accentuated post-COVID in terms of learning catch-up, where those who were anyway deprived before are going to get far more deprived. So it is the knock-on indirect effect that is going to have a much larger, longer-term impact with consequences for the deeper societal inequities of opportunities. So I think this is going to be actually the more lasting crisis. However, I think and I think why this happened, we know there's existing inequality on top of it. The schools were closed. The digital access challenge was sort of just surfaced in terms of widening that inequality further, and especially not only the rich-poor divide, but also the gender divide with respect to the digital access divide. I think that is really the sort of the intersectionality of poverty and gender, I think is particularly biting with respect to the human capital impact of COVID. I think the opportunity here is that, usually any type of remedial or corrective measures with respect to the acknowledging the learning crisis is very difficult for any government. The idea of sort of holding teachers to account, the remedial education part, and so on and so forth. I think now, because of COVID, one could basically say that a lot of these learning crisis challenges are because of COVID, and perhaps that gives us an opportunity to sort of have a different kind of political settlement of some sort, to try and push forward towards that of this some reform to be able to reverse some of these, I think, accelerated inequalities that we may be seeing in the future.
Thank you. Wahideen?
Okay. In health, just to continue with Khairul's point, is that our health system evolved into class division, that the public health is for the poor and the private sector with some posh new hospitals for the rich. That this crisis has shown that that sort of privatization doesn't work. You have to have a strong, decentralized, good public health system. Private health system, however good, is not a substitute for private health system. But having said that, have you noticed that in terms of rollout of vaccines, we are doing much better than others? Why? Because the entire thing is with the EPI, Extended Immunization Program. And they have been very efficient. They know they have the know-how already of how to immunize the children. So that is an advantage we have. In education, what Imran was saying, I mean, it's so sad because our gains were, look at our gains. In the secondary education, almost all the gains in the past 15 years were in the secondary education, students from the poorer households catching up with those from the richer households. In secondary, in gender division, it was throughout in primary education as well as in secondary education, the gender advantage was there entirely over all social classes, from the poor to the rich. This is something very surprising. I should add here that one very strange phenomena is that girls have had an advantage in schooling, whereas in intra-household food distribution, it's still the boys who are having the advantage. Why this is so? Is it to do something with the type of work they'll do ultimately, that the economy still remains brawn-based rather than brain-based, so that the male school graduates will be doing things which are physical, and whereas the female children were doing something with private tutoring out of school or in RMG or some sort of saleswomen or things, something like that. It brings up the question of have we been able to match between the employment opportunities and the school graduates? I mean, our demographic transition has given us the demographic dividend, which we are reaping now. But we are reaping demographic dividend at a stage of preparedness, a bit unprepared, because Bangladesh has got its demographic dividend compared to other comparator countries at a much lower level of per capita income. And we don't know how to use this school graduates who are coming up. And that remains one major problem. That's why we don't have much open unemployment in countries like ours. These are all hidden. But in terms of educated youth, the open employment is now 30%, which is alarming. Thank you.
Let me turn to two other issues. The first one, Imran, you brought up the whole issue of accountability in the education sector. We could apply that to the health sector as well, in fact, to any sector. How does the country ensure that there is accountability and that there are standards that are maintained? This seems to be certainly one of the challenges of government. And yet, Wahideen, you have mentioned the poor governance, in fact, that exists. How do we maintain accountability in the health sector, in the education sector, in all sectors, with governance being not as strong as one would wish? Imran, let me turn to you first.
$1 million question with so many different levels. I mean, I think, look, I think Waidullah sir can talk more about the macro level structural issues of sort of governance here. I think there are opportunities there, but I think from a more micro level, I think there are actually quite a bit of possibilities with respect to social accountability, taking a social accountability, citizens engagement route, a more participatory approach to accountability from the local level. I think the kind of work that BRAC and others were deeply involved in for many, many years, which I think got a bit, kind of a bit sidelined with the kind of rush with respect to a very verticalized program of Millennium Development Goal, I think, era. I think some of those, drip work that needs to be done with respect to citizens engagement, participatory local governance, at the sort of local level, strengthening some of the deliberative democracy forums that actually the government itself has actually created, like open budget forum, the union level forums, the school management committees. How do you get greater synergy? Because we do see that when third party actors such as NGOs work to ensure poor people's participation in some of these forums, they actually work much better. From BIGD, we did a whole state of governance on social accountability. We looked at these local social accountability forums across the country. So I think there are a lot of potential and promise with respect to doing much more with respect to these local level accountability forums by creating a different kind of public-private partnership between the government and NGOs. I think there are deep opportunities there.
Thank you. Khairul, how about yourself?
Richard, yeah. I think, I'm in line with Imran and would like to compliment. Just take the example of community clinic. Around 13,500 community clinics all over the country. And from the government side, the community group, which looks after the, and take care of the, regular attendance of the community clinic healthcare provider. On voluntary basis, they maintain the cleanliness of the campus and then try to manage medicine and gardening, fencing, and so many things. When an NGO facilitates those groups' activity, they are just wonderful. Some of the community clinics, infrastructure, attendance, the pro-poorness, and the empathetic services. Phenomenal work in number of places. Examples have been, created by NGO facilitation, and even in some places without NGO facilitation, where the community groups are selected in a nice way, they themselves proactively actually manage some of the things. Same thing can be said about some of the school management committee. At the grassroots level, some of the school management committees are so active that they take care of cleanliness of their toilets so that the girls can really don't miss 3 days per month during their menstruation and so and so. So at the grassroots level and micro level, some of these works are so prominent and examples are so bright, but unfortunately, they don't really come up to the level of the central level. And where we somehow in between this micro to macro, we get lost somewhere. And that chain has to be established. I don't know how, but the point is that when the central procurement takes place, it gets lost, and all the fingers related to the procurement lapses and all this, which came up in the health sector during COVID time. These are the examples how it can fail. So there are good examples at a macro level where social accountability and social engagement processes are strong. but at the central level, I mean, somehow we couldn't really bring it upwards, but probably Wahiduddin Mahmood sir can really shed certain light on the macro level issue.
There's a challenge.
How can do that?
Richard, can I just
Sure.
what Kyle was saying? I mean, I think one critical link between the micro and the macro or meso is procurement, and I think getting citizens' engagement in procurement is actually really, really important. And there are actually some models. I mean, from the IGD, we are working with the Central Procurement Technical Unit, CPTU, to develop a citizens' engagement model in terms of procurement services, but these are micro infrastructure projects. But I don't see any reason why some of the lessons of that cannot be taken at other levels of procurement. I mean, I'm not talking about a mega project procurement. That's a whole different ballgame. But I'm really talking about more micro procurement. I think we should think about citizens' engagement in procurement and quality of procurement. Thank you.
Thank you. Wahideen, how about we're giving you some
Okay,
thoughts
yes.
here?
Yes. All these are obviously part of overall governance problem. Governance problem where politics is based on patronage politics and parceling out privileges. As a teacher at the university level, when I look at my students, I can see in their preparation where are the missing links in their preparation. Primary school, after all, are mostly public owned. There is some system of recruitment of quality of teachers and so on. There should be more community engagement, and there should be more accountability of teachers attending the classes. That's fine. But the real missing link is the secondary school. Secondary schools are mostly private owned, but at the same time, the governing body is controlled entirely politically. And you'll find in those governing bodies people who are not themselves graduates of secondary schools. So you can imagine the type of politics that goes on in recruiting teachers and so on. This is in sharp contrast with the system of education we had in the pre-partition days. Many of us, including myself, we came from semi-urban, small-town secondary schools. And the secondary schools which were private-owned, schools produced, in fact, the most of the time, best students who topped the nationwide exams. It happens no more. You won't find any schools outside Dhaka where the graduates of secondary schools will do much good. This has again something to do with the type of, not only the type of governance, but also the type of centralized development we have, where everything is located in Dhaka, all officials are in Dhaka. That's why no school teachers, no doctors will with their family will live in outside Dhaka. They will go there themselves alone from time to time. That's why this absenteeism remains. So I should end by saying one thing, that maybe we should learn lessons from this COVID experience, which is that we are saying that we have lost, 1 year is lost. Now, if you think of the real education, our students get the first primary education of 5 years actually in 8 years. That's one reason we are proposing to extend our primary education up to 8 years. So, I mean, but losing 1 year is not a major thing, provided we can revamp our system and can really rectify in terms of quality of education, particularly in terms of access of students from poor families to quality education. The slogan before in the MDG was education for all. We proposed that the slogan should be quality education for students of poor families. Thank you.
I recall when I was at the cholera laboratory, they had a research station at Mittal, and the slogan outside of the school, which was very well known, was "Enter to learn, leave to serve." And so that ethic was very, very strong. Do we have some questions? Otherwise, I have one other last question I'd like to raise, which maybe I'll do since I don't see. In the beginning, Tarun kind of said that he was trying to push the notion of improving science and so on. I think that one of the strengths of Bangladesh has been a very strong research ethic. I think that one of the reasons that ORS did so well in Bangladesh is because it was developed in Bangladesh. And there were many other things that came from the ICDDRB and other research institutions. What do you see? And Imran, let me start with you because you run a research institution. Wahideen, you've been doing it. What do you see as the role of research in human development itself within Bangladesh? Not necessarily to innovate, but also to take innovations from elsewhere, be it microcredit, be it Bcash, be it any of these things, and adapt them locally. After all, that's really what Japan did after the Second World War and so on. It's this culture of research and adaptation. Do you see this as an important issue?
No, I think it sort of clearly is sort of really, really important. I think the whole the kind of the market orientedness of higher education is something that is of critical importance. I think by there's higher education. I think in Bangladesh has almost this kind of a not a fear, but looking down on sort of market orientedness, as almost being anti-intellectual. And I think that's a culture that really needs to be changed, because market orientation is also about being relevant, and it's also shaping the market as well. And I think the industry university linkage is of particular importance in this particular sort of regard. I mean, with respect to the kind of institute that I run, which is a governance and development institute, I think for us, our industry in some ways is the development practice, which is both NGOs and the government. And I think unless we can really link up with that industry in terms of the research and the teaching and the educational work that we do, it's just not going to be it's not going to cut any mustard. So I think that is really, really important. I think the sort of the industry university linkage across all fields, with a real focus on sort of really understanding the market, understanding the pulse of the market, not in an unanalytical way, not in a way to just serve the market, but also to think about the future market as well. So and in terms of shaping it as well. So I think and in that overall context, there's a lot I think universities, higher education in Bangladesh needs to basically work on and learn from. Primarily I think the sort of Southeast Asian countries. I think and in some of those countries, I think they have done much better in this particular regard.
Khairul or Wahideen, you want to comment at all on this?
Yes, having done damage to our educational system, as I said that our secondary school was the missing link. Once you go that path, to rectify it also, to rectify a educational system from top to bottom takes time, because the graduates of the universities will teach the primary school and so on and so on. But there are shortcuts, as you said, that Bangladesh has, the people are entrepreneur, they are given technology, they can improvise, even in informal sectors. So as you said, some of the technologies were developed in Bangladesh, like oral saline or microcredit, where Bangladesh has done much more than better than other countries. Oral saline is something which is cheap. It doesn't cost anything. Still, adoption of oral saline in Bangladesh is much higher than neighboring India, let alone Africa. So, but the problem is that to import technologies from abroad and then improvise it to suit the local conditions require even more expertise than using the technology just taking from the shelves, which means that the education system is a key. Now, if we cannot rectify the system overnight, we should look for innovative ways of making shortcuts, like internet. I mean, the education which is available through internet, it doesn't have a border. I mean, we can use it, a student in Bangladesh can use some of the lectures in internet from Harvard and anywhere sitting in Bangladesh. So that's an opportunity we should. That is also true of our secondary school and primary school, if we have the political will to do so, that we should be able to make shortcuts in rectifying some of the mistakes we have already done. Thank you.
Thank you. Khairul, do you want to comment on this, or I
No,
can
thank
give
you.
you a direct question? One of the direct questions that came from the audience, and I think you may have already touched on this, is the whole notion of what can government do to ensure a standard of care, a standard of health delivery that is consistent throughout the country, or do you see this as just something that is just not possible? Because as you point out, some of the private hospitals simply say, well, we're just not going to take you, no beds. That is, that there is no sense of accountability to the community, to the society. I'll leave it to you. Do you want to address that, or?
May I take this up? I mean,
yeah, please.
Yeah, I think, I mean, when we talk about regulation and especially quality control in the health sector, there are so many subsectors within the health sector. I mean, in education, and then in graduate education, postgraduate education, undergraduate education, nursing services, skilled birth attendant, and so on. And they are diverse across so many directorates. It's a whole Pandora box. I'm just talking about human resource development in health. When you come to the treatment or quality of care, I mean, from the prescription audit to treatment quality and the pricing and number of issues, pathology, the ethical practice, pharmaceutical companies, promotional, ethical promotion. And so which body will actually be controlling some of this? And this COVID actually surfaced so many lacunas in the health sector that we believe that just on an ad hoc basis, if we make a few decisions and try to make a certain ad hoc type of fixation here and there, that's not going to resolve the systemic issues of the health sector, what we have witnessed. The unregulated private sector, the unregulated informal private sector, and so many things came out during this time. We feel that we really need time to debate and discuss and then agree on certain modification and improvement in the health sector, like forming a commission which immediately after independence, our father of the nation formed for education under the chairpersonship of Professor Kudroti Khuda. In the same way, probably it is high time that with someone well respected in the health sector, we form a commission, and for certain number of months or years, we keep on discussing this with number of stakeholders, and then we make all this modification. Because the out-of-pocket expenditure, which is now almost 3/4 of the total health sector expenditure, I mean, it cannot be curtailed overnight or over 1 or 2 years kind of time. It has to be dealt very, very systematically. If we talk about universal health care, if we talk about introducing certain insurance mechanisms so that irrespective of, income or location or anything, I mean, people can get the best quality services, the kind of arrangement we'll have to make, the kind of institutional modification or improvement we'll have to make, it cannot be done in an ad hoc way. So I would lastly recommend that, given the 8th five-year plan, which has came to its effect very recently, and given the allocation of resources in the current budget and upcoming budget that we'll be getting for COVID, that's a huge amount of money. And it is taxpayers' money, or it is borrowed money, but the people will pay for it, pay back. So in order to maintain accountability, probably that kind of commission is extremely, extremely needed and urgent call. That's how I would like to conclude my deliberation. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me take one other question from the chat, and I'll leave it to anybody to answer this. Providing education and training online could cut down the disparity between quality of education in major cities and towns and villages, as you brought up, Wahyuddin. Online education and training could generate greater collaboration between policymakers and educators in Bangladesh, with Bangladeshi diaspora across the world. After all, the Khan Academy was developed by a Bangladeshi. How much resources are given to developing online education, and how much should be given? What is the scope for this to try to bring together the disparities that exist between rural and urban, or between rich and poor? Does anybody want to take that on? The role of online education.
May I?
Yes, please.
There are some initiatives like Khan Academy, offshoots of Khan Academy, which are trying to introduce courses which should be available to students in Bangladesh, adapted for Bangladeshi students, even in Bengali. So these initiatives are funded well by expatriate Bangladeshis. I mean, fund is not that much of a problem, but having internet facilities in rural areas in a way where these things could be, practicably practiced, remains a problem. But the COVID thing, in terms of disruptions by COVID, will be gone soon. I mean, Bangladesh university schools and colleges will be open soon. So we'll be back to normal. But even if we are back to the normal, we should be trying to use internet technologies to, as I said, to have a shortcut to repair the damages we have already done to our education system at different levels. Thank you.
Yeah, Imran, you mentioned that this disparity between men and women, and between what does your research show in terms of connectivity and computer literacy in various parts of the country?
Yeah, no, I mean, it is the inequality is sort of quite huge, and there's a lot that needs to be done in sort of addressing it. But I just want to raise a few, ways in which I think we can accelerate this. So one is, of course, we should think beyond devices. Right, so the access is much more than devices. It's sort of much more about how we need to think about facilitated approach to sort of device usage. We need to think about online and offline solutions, high tech and low tech. We need to think about hybrid technologies. So how do we use community radio along with digital technology to really create much greater access, for instance, right? I mean, during the COVID period, BRAC has been experimenting with community radio approaches through cell phone-based, just feature phones. So I think we really, I think the smartphone access will increase, but I think the divide will be there. So we need to really think about, what we can do with what we have currently. And I think, and to do that, I think we need to really understand how people are using digital technologies itself. People are using, kind of memory cards and swapping memory cards to disseminate and share information. Entertainment is basically for entertainment. How do we learn from some of these innovations that people themselves are doing, where access to some of these devices are unequal and limited and constrained? But within that, we need to learn how people are doing it themselves, and then use that to do some backward induction in terms of what type of innovations we should be doing to support it. And I think, just like the way microfinance in some ways, kind of challenged existing, norms of how banking actually happens and turned it on its head, I think we need a micro digitalization strategy, drawing inspiration from innovations of microfinance, social innovation of microfinance. And I think to do that, we need to learn from people and see how people themselves are using these technologies.
I think that's a very good point. And I suppose one could apply the same thing to certain health messages and health ideas and so on. So we're nearing the end of our allotted time. Do any of you have any last minute reflections that you'd like to make within the next minute or two? And I'll turn to you, Wahideen, as you started this off.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Richard. It has been an enjoyable session. I shall conclude by saying that I started by saying that Bangladesh has done very well in economic growth, and in social sector growth we have even done better, but all this is related to Bangladesh's overall socioeconomic progress. Now, the way we have progressed so far in economically is beyond, we have done well in adopting high-yielding varieties in agriculture, becoming self-sufficient in food. But outside agriculture, the driving forces are low technology, small enterprises, RMGs dependent on low-wage female labor, and export of semi-skilled and unskilled labor. Now, replication of that replication mode will not take us to the next level of economic growth and socioeconomic progress. So, as you mentioned earlier, that skill and education will remain very important in terms of deepening our agriculture, the industrial progress in terms of skills and technologies. All of our progress will be related to how much we can shift from the replication of the existing things to a more innovative, deepening things. Thank you.
Thank you. Imran?
Sorry, I don't. I mean, just one point is, with respect to, I think, understanding ourselves. I think we need to in many ways develop our own frameworks to really understand the mechanisms through which we are where we are, and how do we basically move forward. And this is, I think, a very big intellectual challenge. I mean, I sort of keep on, kind of this whole the Bangladesh surprise that Waheed Mohammed talked about. I think this is really, it looks like a surprise if we use, if the gaze is with borrowed frameworks. And I think one of the biggest intellectual challenges that we are yet to sort of sort of really understand in our own ways, our own narrative, using our own framework. And I think this is really, I think, the big intellectual challenge. And I think unless, we basically take greater control of the knowledge agenda, and sort of, drive it forward, I think it will be difficult to sort of really think about, how do we sort of move forward. And I think this is really, sort of the deep intellectual challenge, because some of the ways we think about governance and linkage between governance and development, democratic institutions, those pathways are not the way in which Bangladesh is progressing. And I think we just need to, kind of, have a much deeper intellectual engagement with these dynamics and with these realities, a more deeper and more honest and open intellectual excursion, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Cairo.
Yeah, I think this is the year when we will be celebrating a lot and we will be recalling our achievement quite a lot. But side by side, we will have to remember that in 5 years' time, we will be graduating ourselves from the LDC status. And in context of COVID, what we have identified, we'll have to address those. Now, in order to address those, the kind of discussion, debate we need to, undertake, and Imran has just said that the democratic space, institution, and mechanism will have to be there. So, on the verge of, another 50 years or for the, upcoming years, what we need to commit is that along with this celebration, in the name of way forward, we need to invite those discussions in a much more informed way and in a much more intellectually, actually, with evidence and, how should I say it, the scientific discussion. We need to create that environment. Otherwise, the challenges that we are facing now will be unsurmountable. The achievement what we have done, it's not, I won't say those were low-hanging fruits, but those were the fruits which were delivered by our frontline health workers. Now this is the time the so-called, the blue-collar and white-collar people needs to really come forward with their intellectual ability and really lay down the pathway in which the health sector would shape itself for the next 50 years. So for that, a serious research-based and intellectual discussion will be needed. And I look forward that country's democratic institution and tolerance level and democratic practices will tolerate that, rather will support that. With that optimism, I would like to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank to all three of you. I think you've summarized it beautifully, that we should celebrate what has happened, but what is this expression? Experiences is the best teacher, but a fool learns from no other. So this challenge to move ahead and to celebrate what has happened, but to learn those lessons and to think about it in a going forward position. And I can't thank all three of you enough for your excellent contributions. I would simply close today's session by saying that it has been a wonderfully productive day. We've learned the history. We have looked at the economic development. We have looked at human resource development, and there is much to celebrate. But the challenges may be even more difficult going forward. It's great to know what we have achieved, but the challenges going forward are going to be real, and it's going to require an open dialogue, a discussion, an openness, and a transparency that must be maintained. On that note, since I really want to end on time, let me remind everyone that this session on Bangladesh at 50 continues tomorrow at the same time as it did today. And I am sure we're going to have some excellent panels and discussions, which I'm looking forward to. And I hope you all can join us at that time, wherever you are. I know that we're probably covering just about every time zone in the world right now, but thank you all, and special thanks to the Mittal Foundation, Chelsea and Tarun, and everyone who's been contributing to today's session. So on that note, I think we have reached 1 minute before the hour. So I will again thank you, Wahyuddin, Imran, Karul, for a really, really wonderful session. Thank you all.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you all.